Very good evening to everyone and a warm welcome to the session on From Master Planning to Strategic Planning. I should also say good morning and good afternoon since we have one panelist from the United States and one from Europe. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Today's session, I'm delighted to invite very interesting panelists today. I will start with Mr. Ravi Chandar, who is a good friend of WRI. He calls himself as a civic evangelist, but we also know him as a person who has chaired many committees. He's been on the Bangalore Agenda Task Force. He's been on the BBMP Restructuring Committee, which was restructuring the Municipal Corporation of Bangalore. He has some footprints in the JNURM conceptualization of the mission. And other than his pro bono urban issues work, he's also non-executive chairman of Feedback Consulting. Thank you, Ravi, for joining us. I'll now introduce Mr. Jagan Shah. Mr. Jagan Shah is Senior Resident Fellow of IDFC Institute. WRI knows him better as the former Director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, where he helmed a premier think tank across various issues of resilience, smart city development, e-governance, etc. We've had the opportunity to interact in the corridors of power in the Ministry of Urban Affairs, when we worked on the Global Housing Technology Challenge, where he was a key contributor to its thinking. Thank you, Jagan, for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Champaka Rajagopal. She's an independent practitioner in the urban policy planning space. She's also a faculty at Azim Premji University and at Sciences Po in Paris. She's also my ex-boss. So that's from our old consulting careers, where she was the head of urban development at Aegis Private Limited, which is a French company. She has experience in large-scale public sector projects such as the Mumbai Master Plan, Bangalore Master Plan, RMP 2015, and several other projects. Thank you for joining us, Champaka. I'd like to now introduce Mr. Hiren Daftada. He is the Deputy Chief Planner at the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai, where he has been for over 30 years. He has the unenviable task of managing one of the densest cities in India and the world, one of the tallest cities as well, coastal city, sort of right there in the middle of so many climate vulnerabilities. So I've also had the privilege of working with him during the master plan process of Mumbai when we were doing the Mumbai Master Plan for 2034. Thank you, Mr. Daftar, for joining us. Next, I'll introduce Mr. Rohit Agarwal, Rit Agarwal as he's known better. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning from New York, I believe. We haven't worked together, but we're very happy to have you here today because Rohit is one of the people who led Plan NYC. This was a strategic plan for the city of New York. He worked very closely, I believe, with Mr. Mayor Bloomberg on this plan. Otherwise, he's senior fellow at Cornell Tech in New York, which develops technology products to make cities better. He's also associated with various organizations such as Sidewalk Labs, Columbia University, and C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Thank you, Rohit, for joining us today. The final panelist is my colleague, Roger Vanderberg. He is the Global Director for Urban Development at WRI. Prior to joining WRI, he worked with the UN, in fact, with the UN Habitat's Urban Lab, which he helped found in 2014. He has led global teams working on a range of sectors. At WRI too, he heads work across strategic planning, urban resilience, housing, finance. And we look forward to his experience, including from the UN, where he's worked across several countries, several cities, and several partners in the urban space. Thank you, Roger, for joining us. I will initiate the discussion today by sharing a few slides. I just have 3 slides. I'm just going to share it. This will help set the context of planning in India and why is it that we really need to look at sort of the problem of planning and how do we solve it. So this is my presentation. I just have 3 slides. So here is what master plans look like in India. One second, let me just minimize that. Yeah, this is what master plans look like in India. This is the case of Bangalore. As you can see, it's a city of 10 million. Hubli, Dharwad, and Mysore are plans of 1 million cities. In many ways, it's just a land use color allocation. It's residential, commercial, industrial, what you see as red, blue, green, yellow. This is allocated irrespective of size and complexity of cities. And this kind of a planning process is very generalized. It leaves out a lot of specificities and needs on ground. We have the issue of sectoral agencies, parastatals who come in terms of, say, public transport, water, infrastructure, electricity. All of these are parastatal departments. They're governed by their own acts and plans, their own implementation schedules, and they don't necessarily interact with the spatial plan of the city like the master plan. Very often, the master plan just accepts the proposals of these various departments and somehow tries to manage the land use around it. Master plans are more violated than followed. We have rates of about 20% to 30% implementation rates at the maximum in our cities. Why is planning, planning without implementation is futile. So, why are we still sticking to this process? This is the Delhi master plan that came out recently, just a month ago. As you can see, again, a splash of colors. You will never guess that one of the largest networks of metro rail in the world runs through Delhi. It's the 5th largest network in the world, but you don't really see it in the plan. It's again a sort of a splash of colors of red, blue, green, yellow. How do we change this? This is one of the reasons why master planning remains outdated. It rests in legislation that is outdated and weak. Town country planning acts in India have typically not undergone These acts, like for example, the 1915 Bombay Town Planning Act, was done at a time, created at a time when cities were not as complex as today, and such large metropolitan cities were not yet imagined. We have empowered parastatals making their own decisions. Micro level planning, which is sort of your ward level planning and neighborhood level planning, completely missing, very, very rarely done in some cities. Planning also is sort of a product. It's a once in 10-year or 20-year product. The master plan of Delhi gets revised once in 20 years. The master plan of Bangalore gets revised once in 10 years. How do we overcome this? We're using legislation, which is, like I said, legacy of the British, but they themselves have moved on from this kind of a planning. Legislation in the UK has moved on to do strategic spatial planning. They've had many acts like the UK Town Planning Act of 1990, the Greater London Authority Act of 99, the Localism Act of 2011, giving a lot of autonomy to the city, through its mayor, of course, in these contexts. And you can see the Greater London Authority plan is a strategic plan anchored by the mayor of London. It's not just a spatial plan. Along with spatial strategy is a transport strategy, an economic strategy, and an environmental strategy. The mayor is also mandated by the act to ensure that all strategies are consistent with each other. You cannot just put a transport and an economic plan together without them sort of intersecting with each other, integrating with each other. They also have to be consistent with national priorities and their goals of sort of internationally remaining competitive and other obligations. The plan is also sort of a mandate for ward levels or the boroughs to then follow and do local area planning. So this is how planning that we have followed over decades. They themselves have moved on a long time ago. So how do we get there? To understand this, I will call upon two colleagues. This is an example of the Spatial Development Plan of London. You can see it's a unique diagram. It fits the city of London and no other city in the world. It's meant for London and its advantages and challenges. How do they set up sort of economic plans? How do they set up projects to trigger economic growth and livability? We'll understand this better from our colleague, Mr. Rit Agarwal. And after Rit, I will request Roger to come and share his experience as well. Rit will talk about Plan NYC in New York and a few other things. He will decide on that. And Roger will talk to us about Johannesburg and how South Africa transformed his planning process. Over to you, Rit, and then Roger.
All right, thanks very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. I'll share my screen. And as privilege of being involved in two strategic spatial planning efforts here in New York from very different perspectives. And I thought what I would do quickly today is share a couple, some observations on those and a couple of lessons that I learned. So the two in question, as was said, One was Plan YC, which started in 2006, was actually released in 2007. I was in the role of Director of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability for New York City. So that was an official role within the mayor. And the fourth regional plan. Some of you may be aware of the Regional Plan Association of New York, which is about to celebrate its centennial. It's been around for 100 years and is a nonprofit entity and focuses regionally. And so, and I was chair of the fourth regional plan effort. So I worked very closely with the staff and had the opportunity to guide a lot of the thinking that went into that. Sorry, I skipped the slide. So these two plans had very similar goals, but from very different perspectives. And I think one observation overall is that what one can really accomplish with a strategic spatial plan depends on where one sits and what powers one has, and you should design your plan with your power very much in mind. And so here with Plan YC, it was an official strategy for the mayor. The mayor of New York is a very powerful role, has many of the city's executive functions under his direct control, and has, generally speaking, a relatively weaker legislative body. And so that what the mayor wants, even legislatively, often happens. We did this through a massive interagency effort because of that direct control. Basically, most of the key agencies were directed by the mayor to cooperate with us, but we also had a strong external advisory board. We focused only on New York City, and we did that strategically. New York City itself is only about 40% of the region's population. But of course, there's a certain amount of jealousy that the suburbs around New York don't generally want to be told how to be by the mayor that they didn't elect. And so we were very cautious not to opine on what happened outside of the city, even though, of course, from a metropolitan perspective, that's really important. The key themes were around accommodating expected growth, maintaining quality of life, and preparing for climate change. It was, of course, one of the earliest efforts at a major city having an aggressive climate action plan. And that also shaped a lot of what we did. It was in the context of moving urban growth. Of course, that's another key component. And we accomplished this plan in only 10 months, which is among the hardest I've ever worked in my life, but nonetheless, we got it done. The RPA plan was somewhat different. It's an NGO. It's traditionally established, or rather traditionally identified with the establishment. The RPA traditionally works very closely with the real estate industry, works very closely with the people in power, not generally believed to be a grassroots organization. For this one, we actually did an unprecedented outreach and partnership strategy with other NGOs, many of whom were much more grassroots in orientation, many of whom were directly and intentionally representative of underrepresented groups. So we achieved diversity and perspective. And of course, it's a regional focus that covers the entire metro area. But of course, an NGO has no direct power. Our four key themes are here: equity, prosperity, health, and sustainability. By 2017, climate change and equity were well-established issues in planning, although health was not yet quite as established. The context, the city had continued to boom, but the suburbs had stagnated then, a little bit reversed now by the pandemic, but not entirely. And this one took a lot longer to accomplish. Each had major successes and failures. For Plan YC, because of that tremendous amount of executive authority, basically everything that New York City controlled directly, we got done. We reinvented 7 major parks. We planted 1 million trees. We did major changes to the building code, which in New York City is under local jurisdiction, not state or national jurisdiction. We replaced a power plant. We abolished dirty heating oil to have a significant improvement in New York City's winter air quality, and a number of other things, including virtually all of the major rezonings that were planned during the Bloomberg administration were adopted. What's not listed here even, and I think related to spatial planning, was that local effort where we did a lot of neighborhood focused planning efforts around individual neighborhood plazas. And basically the failures were where New York City was not in control. Congestion pricing for Manhattan, something we've been trying to get for a very long time, is has to be allowed by the state of New York, not by the city. So we lost at the state level. Only some of our transit investments were funded because our transit system is run by the state and not the city. We tried to require hybrid taxi cabs, and that was blocked at the Supreme Court because of federal preemption. The other thing that we did wrong was actually that we didn't realize the size of the task. We had housing targets that we met, but in retrospect, New York City was so much more popular than even we had expected that housing prices continued to rise. And while we did a good job of getting climate resilience planning underway, we were late to that game. And Hurricane Sandy flooded New York only a couple of years later, at which point very few actual changes had been achieved. The fourth regional plan is much more recent, so we've only got a couple of years of experience. We did get congestion pricing. It'll be implemented in a couple of years. We influenced a number of things. But really the message here is that where we had clear allies in place and where the idea was not entirely new, we've succeeded in a relatively short period of time. Where we've been proposing big new ideas, they haven't taken root thus far. But one of the regional plan association's key theories of change is that these are 10 and 20-year ideas. They are not short-term ideas. And that's a key difference. And so one of my lessons from the plans is things depend on the power you have. If you are in a position of power, that should be a very different plan than if your power is only persuasion. If you have power, you should be including a lot of quick wins and incremental steps. You can command attention and action every day, and small wins build momentum and eventually create meaningful change. By having that goal of planting 1 million trees, we literally every day could put out an announcement that we had planted 5,000 trees that day, right? And it was great to maintain momentum. Ensuring that we have external validators who are signed up to support us was really important. And allocating budgets was critical, because if you have an executive power and you have money and you do not allocate money to your plan the day you release your plan, nobody will believe that you are serious about your plan. And then finally, we did an annual update. We put in the plan, here's the timeline by which each thing is going to be done. And every year we put out a report saying, here's what we've accomplished and whether we're on target or behind. If you only have influence, and this is the case of the NGO, it may be the case of certain underpowered municipal authorities or others, focus on a few very important ideas, because you can only command attention around a couple of big ideas if you're in that position. Ensure that you have lots of allies. Your job here is to have created consensus before your plan comes out. You should still use updates, but it's the power of shaming that really you're employing there. And one of the things I've seen is that you have to ensure that for each of your ideas, you have someone, a partner NGO, and an ambitious politician, a government agency who is going to make it their top priority. All of the things that RPA has achieved from its plan thus far is because either RPA made it their top priority for a whole year at one point, or there was a partner organization that was similarly focused. Some other things are universal. Of course, back up your analysis with data and don't make assumptions. We made some mistakes early on that happily we did the analysis. For example, in New York City, when the population was growing, we initially imagined we'd need a whole lot of new schools. But actually, because the US population is aging, it turns out we didn't need anywhere near as many schools as a straight line population growth analysis would indicate. So it's really good that we did that much more detailed analysis. Drive to the root causes. And this is one of these points about, I think, what's different about a strategic spatial plan. The root causes of spatial problems are not always about space allocation. They're often about institutions, they're about transportation, they're about other things. And a good strategic spatial plan will recognize that often the spatial allocation comes after and as a result of. The corollary is whenever you identify a need or an issue, make sure you know who has the power to fix it or prevent it from being fixed. Quantify your objectives. Something Mayor Bloomberg always said was what you can't manage, what you can't measure, you can't manage. And you can't underinvest in communications. That was one thing I learned. I was ready to put out a report in black and white and line drawings. Happily, smarter people overruled me because having something beautiful is actually really important. And then finally, one of my favorite comments, and I'm having trouble here. Oh, shoot. There we go. Is that remembering that the best plan is the one that actually has impact. And to a certain extent, consistent with your theory of change, you've got to decide which battles you want to fight and which battles you don't want to fight. And ironically, when you have power, that may be the time to choose not to fight certain big battles. And it's been my perspective that with something like the Regional Plan Association, where exhortation and being ahead of the thinking is a good thing, that's an opportunity to take on even bigger ideas that may not take root for another 10 or 20 years, but they need to get out there somehow. So those are my observations from two major planning efforts in New York. Thank WRI for allowing me to be here, and thank you for your attention.
So I'll go ahead. Thanks, Rit, for this great presentation. I think quite a lot of things that you've been saying in the context of New York resonate with a completely different context that I'm going to explain. I want to focus. I'm very thankful to be part of this conversation because strategic planning has been kind of almost an obsession for me for a long time. So I could tell about all the things that I think are good and bad about strategic planning, or what is not strategic, but I thought to kind of, focus on one case. In this case, South Africa. I've been supporting Johannesburg and the South African government in different roles, earlier with UN Habitat in the spatial development framework for Johannesburg, and currently with WRI in really looking at cities at the engines of recovery. So a lot of kind of strategic challenges and following actually their reform process on how they go about strategic planning quite closely. So I want to shed some light on one hand on the Joburg strategic plan, and on the other one on the enabling conditions for that to succeed. So South Africa took on a huge challenge with the ambition to really change and reform urban development and to construct what they call a new deal for South African cities and towns. And that's because the spatial planning in South Africa has been for decades, of course, determined by apartheid planning, divisive planning, exclusive planning along racial lines. So there's a serious spatial construct that defines how people live, where they live, how they have access to services or not. So the idea to create a post-apartheid cities, to kind of think in a new way on how to restitch the city, has been kind of the instinct. That has been the kind of the key driver behind that reform process that's captured under the integrated urban development framework. And it looks at kind of 4 overarching goals and 9 priorities or policy levels. That whole overhaul of planning, of the way that cities plan in South Africa, is a long process. It was also kind of a process that was kind of very consultative, inclusive, bringing many partners on board in the discussion how we should, or how South Africa should rethink and replan their cities. But it also banked on a group of experts that really brought in, as Rit said, the data. What about demographics? How is it actually? What are actually the results of apartheid planning? How can we think about resilience and about risk management? So a combination of consultation of partners and kind of a rich input by research and data to shape a new idea about urban development planning in South Africa, which resulted, in another session today, Stephanie Chetty from the government of South Africa will go deeper in the actual integrated urban development framework. I just touched briefly on it. I will go to the city level quickly, but it resulted in a vision, really a vision on how you create much more kind of socially integrated urban structures and inclusive, And it has 4 strategic goals, and 2 are kind of very key to how this whole new approach of planning was operationalized. It's about spatial integration. How do we restitch the cities? How do we literally bring different people together? And how do we bring actually places where people live closer to where the jobs are? And the second, and that relates to inclusion and access. How do you create accessibility across the continuum of the metropolitan area? This is the governance structure. So how do you implement such an overhaul? And I'm not going to go deep into that, but I want to shed some light on the 3 red boxes that you see below on the screen, because the program, or the kind of the overhaul, provided 3 programs for 3 types of cities. A support program that sits in National Treasury, supporting 8 metro areas. A support program that sits at the Ministry of Cooperative Governments and Traditional Affairs, that caters for intermediate cities, and the third one, which is implemented by the South African Local Government Association on Small Towns. What I find very interesting and appealing is that at the national level, this idea of cities as a key for larger ambitions of the state, and secondly, a clear understanding that, and Regit, you touched upon it, that cities are different. You have different approaches and different models and different needs for different sizes of cities. That is very well understood and being implemented with support programs and financial support through this kind of 3 types of cities. I think not unimportant is this whole, integrated urban development framework also catered for better coordinated donor coordination. So that's the kind of the enabling environment. Then on the spatial development framework of Johannesburg, and you see this very happy picture of me next to Park Stouw, visionary leader, mayor of Johannesburg at that moment. And he asked, when I was in UN Habitat, he said, can you make a much more strategic plan? Because if I read right now the plan for Johannesburg, I don't understand what I need to do or where I need to act upon. So can you make a more strategic plan that is that prioritizes a few key projects in order to implement this idea of the post-apartheid city? Therefore, we started the process, bringing in a lot of partners. And that's very important. And Rit already talked about the complexity between city and metro. You know, this process of bringing not only private sector partners and different departments within Joburg, but also making sure that the plan is kind of connected to the bigger metropolitan context. You know, the airport of Johannesburg is actually outside of Johannesburg. So the city is bigger than its boundaries. So it absolutely requires to look into that metropolitan space. Nevertheless, the spatial development framework itself didn't have a mandate to plan for the rest. So that process of bringing in partners is key. So what the spatial development framework was after is restitching the city, bringing jobs closer to the people. On the right side of the screen, you see in the red dots, that's where the jobs are, and in yellow where the people are. And this is very exemplary for many big cities at the moment, which kind of have developed and are developing much more as scrambled eggs than as a kind of more a city with a clear hierarchy. So it's really kind of a field condition. The other key part that the spatial development framework was after is create access to green and to make sure that, you know, key biodiversity areas would be protected in while facilitating growth. So what's the best thing, or let's say the biggest win of the strategic development framework, instead of doing everything through a consultative process, through a process with the different departments and a kind of research by design, bringing in different data sets, looking at different options, it kind of prioritized 5 strategic projects. And I think that's a big win. So 5 strategic projects around the metropolitan core renovation, the corridors of freedom, the transit-oriented development approach, Soweto, which houses 1 million people, which is a township, a southwestern township, and the renovation of the area. The corridor that connects Johannesburg to the airport, and the mining belt, which sits in the middle. You see it in the blue. It sits in the middle of Johannesburg and used to be the division between the rich north and the poor south. an industrial belt. You know, people that know Johannesburg know that Johannesburg grew because there's a lot of gold in the ground, and a mining belt kind of really was a great barrier between the north and the south. So these are the 5 key projects that the local authorities would invest in and would promote. And then that leads to a zoning plan, but not a kind of meticulous zoning plan with all sorts of colors. 4 main colors: blue, focus on growth and investment; orange, focus on urban consolidation; green, focus on ecological resource protection; and gray, critical biodiversity areas. These are the 4 colors, or the 4 priority urban development projects. And it's quite interesting because it linked directly, there a clear link between capital investment priorities and the colors on this map is made. So you invest in blue and you consolidate in orange. So that's kind of the bigger thinking. So I want to say something and then I close on one of the strategic projects, the Corridors of Freedom. I think one of the big wins of this plan is to really rethink the city through accessibility. So how do you restitch? How do you give people access to jobs? Most of the families, they spend the largest share of their monthly income on actually transport and the biggest time on a day on commuting. So it's a super big barrier to development. So the Corridors of Freedom, investing in bus rapid transport and then connecting it to urban development. And what is interesting about Spatial Development Framework, it provides principles and incentives for local area frameworks to develop. So principles on density, but also incentives, for example, for inclusionary housing, making sure that private developers include a share of affordable and low-cost housing in their plan. And then last but not least, as I said, the link between the actual plan and capital investment is key. So South Africa and Johannesburg is a sophisticated system in which the demand for allocation of resources in public works from the local level is filtered and aligned with the actual strategic priorities. So the demands for capital investments that align with the objectives of the Spatial Development Framework will always be prioritized over others. So this is a way how you can kind of get a machine into place to support bottom-up developments around transport corridors in order to create and restitch that city and create what they call that bigger ambition of the corridor of freedom that give everyone the opportunity to make use of the opportunities that urban areas offer. So a couple of lessons learned, and this is the last slide. So really changing how you plan and strategically plan requires an enabling environment at the national level or the state level. At least that national urban development framework was really key into integrated urban development framework. That idea of looking closely at the different types of cities, you know, the metros versus the intermediary cities and towns. A spatial development framework in Johannesburg, looking at strategic project, making choices and having kind of a priority urban development framework. And then last but not least, you know, then align at the most local level, align priority precincts, principles, and the capital expenditure plan. So I think that sets the kind of the framework of how to go about strategic planning and learning from the South African context. This process has not been finished at all. Everybody here in the audience knows this is a kind of a long-term approach to how to change cities, but also how to think about cities as drivers of national change. And that right now, and that's the last thing, that right now offers the platform to implement a lot of ambitions related to climate, climate and related to actually national recovery. I stop with that. If you let me go, I'll go on because I love this topic. I'm very happy to and looking forward to being part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to Rit and Rogier, for the excellent presentations. Very clear takeaways in terms of, you know, long-term thinking, short-term actions, ensuring budgets are in place, because without the money allocated, you will not see any change on the ground. and of course, needing the intent to be in place as well. So thank you very much for both your presentations. We also have, very clued in decision makers who are looking for alternate processes to where their cities are functioning. And I'll invite Minister Satyendra Jain, who is the Urban Development Minister of Delhi, to say a few words about this.
Delivering strategic projects that trigger urban transformation is critical for Delhi to overcome current and future challenges. We see strategic planning and projects as key tool to shape cities into more resilient and equitable spaces for all. Best wishes to WRI-India for successful Connect KARO conference.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jain. And we have leaders in the Indian context who are keen on creating change, bringing in that urban reform. But what are the ingredients required for that reform? And I will go first to my panelist, Mr. Ravichandran. Sir, you also call yourself the patron saint of lost causes. I remember all of them. So what is your view on sort of the opportunities and challenges of bringing in such planning reform in the Indian context? And what has been your experience?
Thanks, Vijit. Firstly, listening to both Rit and Roger's presentation, clearly it's a case of what it can be. So first, let me just focus on where we are currently. So we had, for instance, in the case of Bangalore, a restructuring committee where we looked at how the city needs to be reimagined and regoverned. And within that, what can we do in respect of the master planning process? Now, one of the first things, and this is let me give you the headline news. It's a report that's gathering dust, which is why I'm the patron saint of lost causes. But it has, I think, though I'm biased, nice ideas, which I'll come to. The first thing we need to understand is our current master planning process. Rajit set it out in terms of every 10 years, 20 years. They're very static. They don't work. I always use one statistic. Our 1995 Comprehensive Development Plan, it's neither comprehensive nor developmental, but anyway, we'll let that go, showed open spaces at about 25%. The latest master plan, which was supposed to come out in 2015 for 2031 and not yet published, shows the open spaces at 4%. So if any proof be required that our current process, as Rajit mentioned, of land use and development control regulations doesn't work, this one figure itself gives you a sense. Clearly, and because we worked closely with WRI and we had learnings from New York and London, clearly strategic spatial planning was the way to go to. But we run into a lot of obstacles in getting there. And one of them is really the spatial bit. In fact, this is just a shout out for tomorrow's session at 2 o'clock, where we are discussing the whole geospatial framework that's being discussed tomorrow. But most of our cities don't even have a central spatial center where information is available, which can be commonly used and shared. Each of our agencies have their own base map. So can you imagine Bangalore having multiple maps in different agencies of which they are working to do GIS? So that's one of our problems. The other problem really is, in the terms of the scale of plans, if I go back to what we had suggested deep decentralization down to the ward level and even the local area level as what is required. And at the same time, we suggested appropriate integration or re-centralization at the city-wide level. That was the essence of our report, a mix of deep decentralization and appropriate re-centralization at the city level. And consequently, the scale of plans we looked at is saying that we need ward level plans, we need zones which are a bunch of wards, then we need city level plans, which are a bunch of corporations that we had suggested, and we need a regional development plan. Now, all this sounds nice on paper, and that this would get coordinated by a central coordination committee at the apex level. But in reality, getting there has been very, very difficult. Today, for example, in a city like Bangalore, we have a 2031 plan which was supposed to have been announced in 2015, still lying in limbo somewhere. So that's really the ground reality. And since we are talking about strategic spatial, it really is the way to go for Indian cities. For one main reason, the leaders in the past, the state has a huge control on cities, and normally the state chief minister is the city development minister. Honestly speaking, it should appeal to them to choose maybe 10 or 15 strategic projects across the entire city of diverse characters. And given the dysfunctional setup that we have got in Indian cities, where you have a city corporation and you have multiple parastatal agencies that supply water, electricity, transportation and the like, actually the strategic spatial projects kind of thing can actually make all these multiple people come together. For example, if I want to set up a garment kind of area in North Bangalore, I can actually focus all agencies' attention from the point of view of bringing water, from transportation, housing needs, electricity. It's actually, you can knock heads together to bring these people together to make the garment park a success. And in the process of doing that, the associated hinterland would also improve, because you would bring the multiple agencies in a focused way to that particular geographic area for the garment park. It could be IT somewhere else, it could be a tourism thing in the inner city, whatever. So we saw the merits of doing that. We have put out reports, but has it gone anywhere? The answer is no. We can discuss subsequently what are the constraints in making this happen. But for now, what I'd like to say is clearly strategic spatial plan is the way we need to go in Indian cities, but we are a long way from getting there. We are still sitting with outdated master planning process of land use and development control regulations which don't work. And any solution has to go in terms of how do we get to where the more developed countries have already reached. Rajit?
Thank you very much, Ravi. In fact, from the situation in Bangalore to situation in Delhi across, to the north, I request Dr. Jagan Shah to come in here. Jagan, as you know, the recent Delhi master plan has also come out. It again follows sort of the legacy frameworks that we're seeing. So what is your sort of take on making this shift towards being more strategic in our planning and more effective and outcome oriented?
Thanks, Rajit. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. There are so many people that one has crossed paths with in the past. I think, Rajit, everything that has been said about strategic planning in Indian cities, both by Rit as well as by Roger and by Mr. Ravichandran, all of it is true. In fact, everything we say about strategic planning is like making motherhood statements. It's all wonderful to have. But like Ravi said, how do you get that? How do you get there? And I just want to draw our attention to that. Let's start, for instance, by something that you said, which caught my attention, Rajit, that you said that neighborhood level planning is not taken account of. Actually, that's untrue. The master plan for Delhi, for instance, has local area plans, which are meant to be created as a cascading level of planning right from the regional plan level. The master plan for Delhi actually fits in as a sub-regional plan for the regional plan. And through the zonal development plans to local area plans. But the error, and this is linked to what Rit said about power and influence, the error was that the Delhi Development Act makes the responsibility of making local area plans that of the municipal corporation, which is interesting because it's a very enlightened move when you look at legislation. But it simply never took place because the power struggles between state government, the central government, as well as the municipal corporations has never been able to align. And so you've got this complete mishmash. I think we shouldn't condemn the MPD 2041 yet. It is still a work in progress. It hasn't been finally notified. I'd like to mention that some of the heartening things that are going to happen in that plan is, one, that the infrastructure is going to be brought out of the appendices where it usually used to reside into the actual structural plan for the city. Secondly, it addresses land management issues. It addresses tenancy and tenure and these kinds of issues. And it addresses coordination. And I think coordination is the key point here. The other thing is, and here again, I echo what Ravi said, there are many reports that lie on the shelves. I was a team leader at NIUA in 2006 when we did a peer review of the Delhi master plan on behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development, which looked at the London Key Plan, which looked at the Plan NYC exercise, and also pointed out what was then a rage, which was the Chongi Chong redevelopment in Seoul, which showed how area level planning could actually be done successfully. However, that report lies in the shelves of the Ministry of Urban Development. I mention this because I think we need to understand that we continue to struggle with the same issues over and over again. And therefore, this remains a pie in the sky that we should do strategic planning, but we don't have the wherewithal. And I want to mention two reasons why we don't have the wherewithal. One is what Rit said about data. Unless data is available at a granular level, unless the city is measuring itself, its metabolism, if I can use jargon, you can neither inform the public about how their city performs or how it affects their lives, nor do you inform the planner well enough to empower them to actually make effective, impactful planning. Ravi might remember when we were part of the India at 75 committee that we were pursuing the idea of data observatories. Now, that's something that the Ministry of Urban Development has also been promoting. But how do you get the state governments, which have the constitutional responsibility for managing cities, how do you get them to create data observatories? So the challenge of all of this in India is perhaps of a magnitude which we do need to take into account. And I want to just end with one last point, and that's about capacities. When we were asked by DDA at NIUA, when I was director there, and we secured the contract for making the master plan for Delhi 2041, we were acutely conscious of the fact that we don't have the capacities, not only within the institution, but also in the larger ecosystem to do what we would have liked to do, which is make all the local area plans on behalf of the municipal corporations, make it so that at least for once MPD 2041 has all local area plans done. I believe the team at NIUA is still pursuing that dream. I hope that it actually manifests itself, because clearly, even if we were to do the granular planning that we need to do, we may not have the capacity in our cities and across the country of the number of planners, urban designers, architects, and others that are required in order to do this at that granular level. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagan. In fact, WRI itself is an anchor institute to the ministry for their micro level planning effort, which is on LAP and TPS, local area plans and town planning schemes. And despite, going through several town planning acts where the provision actually exists, it doesn't stop you from making a local area plan or a town planning scheme. These pieces of legislation lie dormant. So there are enablers, but as we were speaking, the implementation, the realization is really poor. I'd like to call on Mr. Hiren Daftardar, in many ways, the practitioner on this panel, working at MCGM in Mumbai. Sir, you've been part of the Mumbai Master Plan, one of the most difficult plans in the country to do. How do you react to this? How do you see even in a case like Mumbai, which is quite unique, where the municipal corporation is preparing the plan, unlike development authorities in other contexts, you still have challenges of several parastatals, say metro rail coming in, etc., many of which you have to accept the alignments of rather than negotiate with. How do you see strategic planning and the opportunities in our context in your city?
Thank you. Am I audible? Thank you for giving me opportunity. Currently, Mumbai has a plan in place, which was started, the preparation started way beyond 2009. The plan was published in 2016, sanctioned in 2018. It is a typical plan, for earlier we had, this is the third development plan. We had a development plan in 67, 91, and this all were prepared in-house by municipal engineers. Only this time we had employed planners like you and Sampaka for doing the plan. But for earlier two plans, all the plans were prepared by engineers. That is why I call them as a mathematical plan. A typical plan framework is forecast planning population scenario 2 years beyond, 20 years for the horizon period, calculate the amount of FSI, calculate the amount of city space required, public facilities, roads, stormwater drains, then your open spaces, calculate that, allocate wherever possible, and allocate the zoning for that, and finish off the plan. That is how the planning process has gone in Mumbai for last 3 plans. In current plan, while we were doing this current plan, we had a lot of public outreach. Sampaka may be knowing that we had a lot of workshops for knowing the citizens' perception, public representatives' perception for 20 years Mumbai. So we were asking every time, how do you want Mumbai to be at say 2034? How do Mumbai should look like at 2034 horizon there? Because that was the horizon plan for Mumbai or the development plan. So these were the common questions we were asking for this public outreach program. Luckily, the plan went through smoothly. The one plan we was cancelled. The second plan went very smoothly because I think we had a very strong political support. For earlier plan, we didn't have any strong political support, but this time we had very strong political support. This is my perception that because of that political support, we did the plan smoothly. There were no controversies. Like in Mumbai, every inch matters. So there were no controversies like somebody's plot we have reserved for some strategic purposes and we moved that reservation ultimately. So these type of controversies were not there. But because of that political support, we could complete the plan and we have now started the implementation. Now coming back to this strategic planning, while preparing this plan, we had envisaged that every 5 years we'll be monitoring and evaluating the plan performance. And this we know that for the earlier 2 plans, the implementation percentage was hardly from 20% to 40% plan was implemented. So this year, as soon as we published the plan, we started allocating funds for implementation of a development plan. So we had identified certain lands which were municipal land, government land. We started demanding those lands from government, from municipality, and we are now every year we are allocating some money for implementation of a DP. This year only we had some less amount because of the COVID and all that. All the municipal proper money was spent for fighting COVID, building new temporary facilities for COVID hospitals. So this year only we had less, we had allocated around 500 crore for implementation of a DP for this year. But for last 4 years, we are allocating to the tune of 2,000 to 3,000 crores for implementation of a DP. For this, Mumbai land is privately owned land. So we have to acquire the land. And because of very high market prices, we have to pay 100, 2,000, 3,000 crores to a plot owner for taking his land for civic projects. So that is one problem we are facing. And another problem we are facing is people are not understanding the plan per se, because there is a different understanding for the public, different understanding to the politicians, and different understanding for municipal corporations. So that is why I think the strategic plan has to become. We have to have some strategic plan in Town Planning Act. It has to be built in Town Planning Act. Unless and until it is a part of any act, we will not be able to move towards from master planning exercise to the strategic planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daftar. Clearly, Mumbai, of course, a very unique context. Land price is equal to New York. You have several challenges to manage. I'd like to come to Champaka now. And Champaka, you worked on innumerable master plans in the Indian context. So you have sort of that pan-India perspective of how master planning works and doesn't work. What would your reactions be to strategic planning as presented today?
Champaka, you are not audible.
Yeah, you're muted, Champaka.
Thanks, Rajat. The two big plans that I have worked on, and one that I co-led, was the development plan for Mumbai, along with the Municipal Corporation for Greater Mumbai, and a whole host of experts that were established on that team as well. But today, I felt, having listened to both the presentations, brilliant presentations, I thought it would be important for me to reflect on a couple of processes that were established previously in the Indian context through nationally sponsored scheme, as well as a few other aspects that are pertinent to specifically to projects as strategic instruments that you've rightly highlighted in your note. And thanks for that brief that you set out for all of us. So, I'd just like to reflect on one particular component of discussion that we've had from both the presentations with respect to capital investment and capital investment planning. And I'm sure both cities, New York and Johannesburg, have their own political contentions and planning processes. But at this moment, amongst all of us here today, is to reflect on the gaps that we have in the Indian context and what has worked elsewhere. So at Johannesburg, since I've had the opportunity briefly to work as part of the World Bank's team at Jakarta, this was with the City Planning Labs initiative with Dr. Gayatri Singh there. There was a brief opportunity to interact with the planning agency at Johannesburg. And what was really striking was how well the spatial development framework, as well as the spatial area framework, the SDF and the SAF, are intrinsically integrated with the capital investment planning process. And there are three key innovations that I'd really like to highlight over here. And please correct me if I'm wrong on some of the strategic highlights, but I believe these are the key important points. One, that budgetary allocations made by the city or made through grants received from the center or the province are spatially linked. So people can actually see exactly where the money is going. And those 5 strategic projects in Johannesburg are very much representative of how money and public or private finances are linked to spatial impact. That's one very important innovation. And I think there's of course a lot of resistance in our context, because transparency to that extent will bring about great levels of vulnerabilities out there in the public. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why there's resistance to making this linkage between spatial priorities for introducing projects with the financial allocations. The second is that there are 4 steps, and each of these 4 steps involve fierce negotiations between agencies, which is led by the mayor's office. And the 4 stages are the delineation of projects, the project prioritization phase, which is of course a political process, budget fit, how much budget do we have, how does it meet with the requirements of the projects that have been delineated, and then devising alternative funding sources for projects that are facing scarce resources, right? So do we need to explore other kinds of financial instruments, fiscal instruments, to enable generation of finances for executing these projects and to operate them. So the process is politically driven by the city government, by the mayor's office, and it is through a participatory process, and that's really important, I think. The third is that the CIP framework is meant to allow city governments to gradually build capacity to think medium to long term and plan to augment their fiscal and financial management capacities, while also forging partnerships with other organizations, other public organizations, private sector agencies, or the civil society, as the case for New York shows very well. And I'm emphasizing particularly on the capital investment planning framework and the mechanism and the need for institutionalizing this in our context, because this is not entirely new for us. And Mr. Ravichandran would have much more to say about this, but the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission did in fact aim to institutionalize such a process already. And through experience, many of us here can confirm that the JNNURM scheme greatly enhanced local government capacities to augment service delivery, even though many of the mandatory reforms, quite naturally, did not all neatly fall in place. So while the struggle to garner political acceptance of local area planning is equally important for us in the context of Indian cities to bring back the agenda of institutionalizing capital investment planning processes. And I'm emphasizing this again and again because it's not going to be entirely new. We've experimented with this in the past with specific agendas to use the capital investment planning framework as a means to introduce or induce the implementation of many of the mandatory reforms that the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act sets in place. I'll stop over there, Rajat.
Thank you very much, Champaka. Many points resonating with what Rit Agarwal also presented. So I'll go to Rit now, also because we have sort of moved into the pathways to, where do we want to go and how do we institute sort of long-term outcome-driven planning in some sense. Rit, what would you say are some of the ingredients that are required to do strategic planning? Champaka's mentioned a few, such as ensuring capital investment. Unless those budgets are seen, unless they're spatially linked, and people can see where that money is going, it will not really result in anything on the ground. And we've seen, several examples of how things don't happen. Would it also require, say, for example, an active citizenry or a more mature citizenry who know they can participate in city processes and budget allocations, etc.? What would you say are some of the underlying ingredients required to go through with a successful plan such as this?
Well, I think, I mean, all of these comments resonate, and Champaka, even more than the capital allocation, the recognition that strategic planning is fundamentally political in nature resonates with me very deeply, right? And because I think there is a tendency among planners and urbanists and architects to be technocrats, when in fact, bringing all of this together is a fundamentally political effort, right? And thinking that we're going to super professionalize it actually leads to failure. So I'd say that's one, which involves an active citizenry, but I'm not convinced that every New Yorker or every Mumbaiker has to have felt like they participated in a plan for it to resonate. It just has to resonate, which is what politicians that are successful, figure out how to say things or how to tap into an issue or tap into a preference, right, that resonates with people, even if they haven't actually gone out and talked to everybody, right? So there's that political instinct. That is one. And then I think this point about capital allocation, again, I would make an argument that there is, and I think the Regional Plan Association example demonstrates it, that there is a way that entities without budget authority can influence it. Is it a replacement for central strategic planning? Definitely not. But can it fill in some of the gaps? I think it can, if it's done in that thoughtful way where you're shining a light on a limited number of needs and you're building consensus among realistically the elite. To a certain extent, RPA, we often think about the fact that even in a region of 20 million some odd people like we have here in New York, there are 20,000 people whose opinion fundamentally matters much more than anybody else's, right? It's just a fact of life. Those are the people in charge of government agencies, of large corporations, people with money, et cetera. It's the reality. If you can get a reasonable amount of consensus among those folks about what should happen, you can actually shape things. And then a final observation on something that's in the RPA's theory of change is the idea that if you put a fully formed thought out there and you built a certain amount of consensus around it among that elite, you actually set the stage for a politician to decide that this is a good idea for their purposes. You don't know who that person is going to be. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you've kind of laid out a number of tools that somebody with power can eventually pick up. And again, that speaks, I think, to the idea of packaging a handful of big initiatives, because no politician is going to take some very wonky set of technocratic ideas and somehow make it a campaign theme. But if it's a big piece of infrastructure or a big strategic change or a big reinvention of this district, like that can be something that somebody makes a signature and builds a political career out of. And RPA has had a significant track record of doing that, because it is in a similar way. I mean, one of the biggest problems New York City has faced forever is that our region is divided up among 3 state governments. There has never been any official regional planning entity. And frankly, we don't think there could be, because of the legal issues around how you would have to do that across 3 states. And so that's where the RPA fits in a power gap.
Thank you, Rid, for that insight. And I should take that to Jagan Shah here, because Jagan, you've been part of the process. You've seen how policies are made, how decisions are made at the center and at the state, being at NIUA. This question about, is it about sort of the capital investment plan really? Is it about, the political will, the decisions are taken at the political level or the technocratic level? Where would you stand in this? And for a context like India, which of these sort of motors do we need to get running first, or in which succession?
Thanks, Rajat. Tough question to say, but I must admit that my interactions with planning in India is not only when I was at NIUA. Since 2004, at least, I've been involved from the JNURM city development planning exercise, in fact, providing capacity building and training as well for the purpose. My point about the capital investment point, much as, again, I love it, it's fantastic, but we must keep in mind that cities don't decide investment for themselves. In fact, most cities and very few state governments in this country even have a fiscal situation where cities have the ability to put in the capital investment into infrastructure, let alone anything else, right? So we must keep this in mind. As the Finance Commission has shown us, most of the money being spent in our state governments by the municipalities is being spent on salaries. It's not being spent on public works. So, which is why there is a dependence on the central government to constantly put in the fiscal stimulus that helps to build some of that new infrastructure. So in some fundamental sense, we should make the best of what we can with that stimulus money. And in some fundamental sense, what we as a polity tend to do is to squander those opportunities. We did that with JNURM. We've been doing it with a lot of the urban programs currently being implemented in the country. Unprecedented levels of money being spent on cities, and yet cities themselves don't want to take ownership of that money. So it's a very paradigmatic and odd situation. But to come back to a point which I think Rit said, I think the building of consensus can be done around specific, what I would refer to as anchoring issues, right? So to my understanding, mobility has become a key anchoring issue in a lot of cities in our country. People are alive to the point about mobility, which is linked to productivity, people's ability to do shorter commutes, to travel in a more safer, more comfortable way so that they can be more productive, in fact, be more healthy. This is a very important anchoring institute, and of course, anchoring issue, and WRI has done really a lot of work in bringing that about. So congratulations to WRI. The other is transit-oriented development. So build on the mobility as an anchoring issue, and then let people see that around mobility, a city can evolve into a new shape and form. So everybody needs to be alive to sort of city form per se. I think, and Rit helped us do this when we were devising the smart city mission. I think area-based planning, taking bite-sized chunks of cities in order to actually improve the infrastructure and the built form there, is a good strategy. It may be much maligned because of whatever politics there is around the smart cities mission. But having said that, it is a good strategy. It will hold us in good sway in the long term. My last 2 points are about green and blue infrastructure. I think the public today and the influencers that Rit was talking about, that top 20% of the influencing public, are alive to the need for cities to have green and blue infrastructure. This is linked to climate goals, but it's linked to people's health and well-being. And that's what worries people now, right? And I would lastly say that we need consensus around housing. It is ridiculous that 50% of the city is housing, and yet there is no discourse about housing in our country. We talk about the implementation of government schemes. We don't talk about housing as an issue, as a political issue, to use Rit's words again. And it's a hugely political issue because there are exclusions and denials built into the way in which housing provision has been done in this country, which is rendering our cities into battlefields where they don't need to be. So the idea of housing as infrastructure is something the government recognizes, but the larger polity is not yet understanding or giving enough importance to. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jagan. I'll take it to Ravi here. Ravi, you've heard the conversations. In fact, in the Bangalore situation, when you had the rare chance to look at restructuring a municipal corporation, you actually took some bold moves, which could also have been, which were also contested in the sense of, bringing the chief minister back at the city level to take city level decisions, sort of re-centralizing, where people say that if you bring the chief minister in, you can never get him out. But your stance was he's in already. So we are way past sort of the 74th amendment. We're way past trying to figure out whether the mayor can come back and lead a city like in other contexts. We know that's a lot of water under the bridge now. You had looked at several options, including whether a minister for Bangalore. I mean, could you tell us a little more about thinking about it differently from established ways?
So one of the things really is we have a constitutional flaw at birth. The center state, the first tier and second tier got clearly defined. But when it came to the third tier, the word that was used was local bodies. And that is a price that we are paying for. And the 74th for cities doesn't work and still doesn't fix the problem. So I think we should cease being in denial that we have a concept of a city government. We don't have. So if I take a city like Bangalore, which is representative of many cities, the state calls the bulk of the shots. The mayor only gets to be called a worshipful mayor. There is nothing worth worshipping in the post of the mayor. So it is the state, and the earlier we realize that the state calls the shots, it is nice to say that we can roll back all the parastatal functions back to the city and manage it there. Not going to happen. Of course, there are places like Kerala where the mayor is more powerful, etc., but those are exceptions. So my sense really is, and that is what our report said, we said get the CM in and we go for a directly elected mayor over a 5-10 year process, because it's an admission of the ground reality that they call the shots. So we might as well evangelize the good ideas with the person who's calling the shots. So I'm really being more pragmatic than trying to be idealistic. So I really believe we need to go and focus our efforts there. Now, for example, Jagan mentioned about the various schemes. So whether you take Amrut or Smart City, it's another problem. Each of those schemes are in separate silos. They don't even get integrated with the plan of the city per se. So they just land up from somewhere with some funding and get done, and we don't even have that alignment. So I really believe that re-centralization is required, but we also believe, which is the technocratic answer, that we need to follow principles of the subsidiarity principle and activity mapping. So you decide what is best done at what level. For example, garbage handling is better decentralized and handled at the local level. Transport planning, clearly even at the regional level, even more than the city level. We need to get those things in place and accepted by the system, that these are things better done at the local area and these are things better done at the central area. Now the problem when I say that we go to the state, the resident welfare associations we are noticing are increasingly becoming more active, and particularly in COVID times we have found that the RWAs are active, but they need to cross one more bridge, which is happening slowly. Most of us in the middle class who are semi-activists or working with civil society, we are more comfortable dealing with bureaucrats. We are less comfortable dealing with the political system. So whether it be the corporator or the legislator, we need to increasingly engage with the political class for the changes that we need. And I think slowly the resident welfare associations are realizing that we need to engage more politically and not with the bureaucrats whom we feel comfortable with, is another thing that is required as part of the overall fix. So basically, and also one last quick point about what Jagan said, which I think is relevant on housing. I've been a great believer that the way forward is social rental housing on scale. And the government has absolutely no thinking in terms of how do we get to social renting on scale, because there's new concepts of the 15-minute city or the 5-kilometer city where 90% of our needs are within a smaller thing will require social rental housing. So to come back, Rajit, to the question that you asked, I believe that we have to work with the state government. It's a pragmatic choice because I don't think it's feasible to get into that truly empowered mayor, city government. That bus, I suspect, has left the station, is not going to come back. So I would engage with the state, and I would engage in the sense that within that system, the city corporation, we are very clear what they can deliver, and they are an empowered city corporation to do that. And we need to find ways to coordinate the various parastatals. The challenge for all of us in Indian cities is we need outcomes which are interagency dependent. Corporation and many agencies, we need outcome oriented thinking, and everything about our government is talking about multiple crores of finance projects and silos of implementation of those projects. So we really have to thread this needle across agencies to get outcomes, which is missing in our city space and city-state space. Now, it's a long journey, but I really think, as I think Rit mentioned and others mentioned, I would think large strategic projects will appeal to the people at the state level who control the city. And I think we have to entice that system through smart projects of that kind, geographically spread out, diverse in what it achieves. And that has to be the route. So we have to appeal to them in the sense of how that is going to be different, will make them look good, because there's this other notion that good governance and good projects don't necessarily get you re-elected based on some anecdotal data of the 2000-2002. I think we have moved on, and I think it could help if we actually worked on the system to get them to see the greater glory that they will get if they go down that route. It needs to be done in a non-threatening manner. It needs to be embraced by them. Some will be top-down implementation and some will be bottoms-up. In theory, we know what needs to be done. The challenge is to get it executed on the ground. Rajit?
Thank you, Ravi. I'll go to Hiren Daftadar from here. As you know, sir, we've spoken about various aspects, whether political, budgetary, finding that core issue to lobby around. But from your point of view as a technocrat, you are the Deputy Chief Planner of the city of Mumbai. What will enable you to go about better strategic planning? Do you require sort of the backup of a Town Country Planning Act that is modified to give you the powers to move forward? What can really help you? Because in the situation you're in, it will be difficult to start figuring out, say political lobbying, people participation. It's a complex process to enter into. Would legislation be the route for you? Just a question.
Rajit, we have some kind of strategic planning inbuilt in Town Planning Act, like local area plan, that is there. We have a 1966 plan having a separate act, section for local area plan. But no city in Maharashtra has tried that. I think the reason behind it that the procedure for following that local area plan is same like DP, like you publish a plan, suggestion, objection. So even for a smaller part of a locality, you have to go through all these processes. So that is why no one has tried that local area plan. Another thing is that whenever we make a plan, at least in Mumbai, I know we have, or other cities in major cities, like we publish a report. Always there is a report accompanied by a plan, like drawings, you can see the maps and the DC regulation. And whenever that plan gets sanctioned, what it gets sanctioned is only the plan, like maps and the regulation. No one looks on the report, because report says everything, how the plan is to be implemented, what are the ways, what is the budget allocation to be made, and how is this report. We had two reports, 2015 report and 2016 report, but both reports were not considered by anyone. No one looked at that report. I think we should have a support of legislation as well as bureaucrats, because in every state there is an urban development minister and urban development secretary who are actually a pillar of sanctioning the plans. So they should also be emphasized that, look, we have some report also, because that report has to be taken seriously, because in this report we have a chapter for monitoring and evaluation of a plan on our own, because I am part of that process and because I am part of that team which worked for the DP, and now I am in a role of a implementation of a DP. We as a small team, we are now concentrating on monitoring and evaluation aspects, because we know how we have prepared the plan, what have gone into the preparation of plan, how much hours we have spent on drawing the plan, discussing the plans with various other these stakeholders and all that. So we know what has gone that. So we are now focusing on monitoring and evaluation. So that is why we are now forming a team of, say, smaller team, like 10 people, who are basically focusing only on monitoring, gathering the data from various other implementing authority like MMRDA. Then we have in Mumbai, we have a lot of special planning authorities where we are not supposed to do any planning. That is also one aspect. That is a separate subject actually. But we have a lot of holes in our plan. Like BKC, there is no Mumbai plan. It is a separate plan. Now, Mumbai Port Trust, a biggest landowner in Mumbai, they are having their own separate plan. MHADA, they are approving authority for building proposals. So that these kind of things, there are, because of the act, they mandate that we can have a special planning authority. These planning authorities have come. Like that, we should have some support in our legislation for strategic planning also. Otherwise, every 20 years, every city will be making a plan. Every city will be revising that plan after 20 years. So that process has to stop, and we should have a smaller plan. Every 5 years, we should monitor, we should modify the plan. If required, we should gather the data. And the data, basically the data is major. Like I think Jagan said that data is the most important. Unless and until we have a data, and data in open source. Now I have a data, but I cannot share with anyone because there are data limitations, because there are limitations of sharing. So that because if you have data in public domain, then even anyone can go through that data and give suggestions for monitoring and evaluating the plan. And the budgetary allocation, like budget for a city of Mumbai, the implementation of a DP cost around 14 lakh crore. If we put entire municipal budget even for implementing of DP, will be going to halfway. We will not be reaching 100%. So that budgetary allocation from state and central and strategic planning legislation are the need of the hour for successful implementation of a DP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daftar. I'd like to go to Champaka here. Champaka, we're talking a lot about, in many ways, as different panelists have mentioned, we do have good plans in place. There is good intent. The writing is there. However, as Mr. Daftar was saying, the challenge then comes in the implementation end of things, monitoring, evaluation, implementation. And as we're talking, a lot of it is also in strategic projects. How do you see projects, and you have done some work in contracting. So if we could hear very briefly from you, how do you see strategic projects translated through efficient contracts?
Sure, thank you, Rajat. Prior to sharing some of my own insights on contracts, I just also wanted to clarify my own position on institutionalization of a process such as the capital investment planning mechanism, for instance, that I spoke about earlier. There are examples of how cities in other countries in the global south have actually incrementally institutionalized this process, right? And in ways that are suited to cities at multiple scales of large cities, medium-sized cities, and also, of course, with respect to political resistance that comes around in each of these cities. So I just wanted to say that I'm definitely very cognizant of the fact that the process of institutionalizing something as strong as the CIP mechanism is, of course, very complex. And there are smaller steps through which it can be done. And since multiple other schemes like Mr. Jagan Shah mentioned, there are several schemes that are nationally sponsored that have already initiated many such increments already. And I think there's definitely a rife ground over there to push that agenda forward. Building on also what Mr. Ravichandar was mentioning, that we do have a constitutional framework, but of course we know that we need to work around the existing ground realities and navigate the existing political motivations. So I think I just wanted to clarify my own position over there. To respond to your question, Rajat, yes, I think I'd like to go back to one particular problem that you've highlighted in your brief that you shared with all of us, that there's basically a huge problem about convergence amongst institutions, and that's been a perennial problem, right? And when I say institutional variety over here, I mean institutions that are mutually conflictual in nature in terms of the motivations they are driving. So for instance, public organizations are driven by their welfareist agendas as opposed to private sector firms that are basically backed by profit-making motivations. And if we're talking about large-scale projects, strategic projects, then of course, many of these projects will involve complex partnerships, public-private, civil society organizations, and these are all dissimilar organizations that are sort of put together to work with one another. So that gives rise to a very complex space over there, and they're all making decisions at multiple scales. We're not in the pre-existing era when delegation formed the basis of decision making. So I think scales at which decisions multiple scales at which decisions are taking place is also complexifying the context of project governance itself. And I'd like to take, knowing well that since the early part of 2000s, national governments as well as subnational governments in our context have increasingly mobilized large infrastructure projects as part of city development agendas. Whether they're integrated or not with spatial planning is a different discussion. But these have been dominant instruments for dealing with public problems. For example, both national state governments have been aggressively advancing mass transit in large metropolises, particularly to deal with the problem of congestion, for example, or deteriorating air quality and so on. And at the micro levels, at the local levels, we've had projects that are commissioned by municipal governments. These are much smaller projects, of course, and which are taken up between elections, but they're still projects that are taken up through specific gated contracts. And I'd like to draw our attention to one specific aspect of urban projects and risks that has typically not been discussed in strategic planning in India so far. This is the problem of gated contractual governance of projects. And now on public projects, contentious outcomes of rigidity and flexibility in contracts or in regulations has been amply discussed for more than 3 decades or more. I would like to highlight the problem of incomplete contracts. Microeconomists such as the Nobel laureate Oliver Hart has argued and demonstrated very well that it's not possible to write long-term complete contracts. And given that public projects involving partnerships between the government, the private sector, and other hybrid agencies has increasingly become mainstream, long-term public contracting is inevitable. Now, the issue is that incomplete contracts produce and reproduce the problem of residual control rights. Under conditions where contractual clauses do not exist, transacting parties, whether public or private, are not bound to behave in a mutually constitutive conduct that supports public interest. In the vacuum of contractual incompleteness, the relationship between transacting parties ceases to exist. So all contracting parties then tend to act in self-interest as opposed to public interest. That's a huge problem. So the result is prolonged disputes, even litigation, which often lead to inordinate project delays. They lead to disproportionate project cost escalations and a host of other financial crises and issues. Who bears this risk? These are often transferred back onto the public agency and finally onto the taxpayer. The private party is also not absolved of risks in this case. If we're looking at large projects, public-private partnerships, and contracts that are sort of gated over there. So everyone loses in the bargain. The discussion on contentious outcomes of incomplete contracts is critical, I think. And I've written about this myself, in particularly with respect to transport infrastructure projects, which is available online. But I just want to highlight that while we're talking about these large-scale strategic projects, it's very critical for us to pay attention to the nature of contractual governance that plays out, because it's a complex set of incomplete contracts that tend to exacerbate risks for all parties involved, not just the public sector, but all parties involved. Yeah, over back to you, Rajat.
Thank you, Champaka. We're completely out of time now, but I will give the last word to Roger, since he's been waiting. Roger, is there any secret bullet, silver bullet for us? For example, if South Africa and Johannesburg managed such a huge transformation, did it take literally the president or the prime minister to effect that change? Could you give us the last word from your end and we'll close it? We have literally 1 minute.
Well, it's very kind of you, Rajit. I don't have to have the last word. Many things. There's no silver bullet. I mean, I think the whole conclusion of this conversation is that there's no silver bullet. And so I just wanted to one thing that resonates a lot is about the political nature of strategic projects and plans. That is one thing. It's a negotiation, and where's the mutual interest, there is the biggest opportunity. That requires that coalition building, gathering different groups of society, private sector, politicians, bureaucrats, academics behind this kind of transformative project is really key. So thinking very cleverly about the process, not because we like process and we don't like outcomes, no, because we like outcomes and we don't like unnecessary process. So cleverly think on how you shape this coalition of the willing, because as has been said, there is no one solution for resolving equity issues of climate, issue of kind of spatial complex. So where is that coalition of the willing? So that is really important. And I think then the second thing that so this is not a conclusion, this is just the second thing that resonates a lot is that where is the kind of the collective, or where is the opportunity to invest? Is it through the infrastructure program? Is it through the climate agenda? Or is it through resolving the housing crisis and you have the opportunity to direct and to drive a project through one of these entry points? So sorry, Rajit, no silver bullet at all. I think the panel was fantastic, really resonating many of the issues related to strategic planning, and happy to join further conversations around it.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for giving us your precious time. We've had a great conversation. We hope to note this down and send it to you all as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aarti and I work with the WRI-India Cities team. And I'd like to welcome you all to the last session of today, a very pertinent and timely discussion, I believe, on mainstreaming climate action in India. With India swiftly urbanizing, the carbon intensity of its rapidly expanding urban middle class is yet to be locked in, as already across the world, cities and their citizens have begun to experience the effects of climate change. Understanding how cities can anticipate these effects, achieve mitigation, and become more climate resilient is key. In today's session, we will discuss how cities can build mitigation and adaptation capacities to manage long-term climate, especially by leveraging infrastructure investment. Now, I would first like to invite Dr. Daniel Bradley from the British High Commission in India to open the session today. Dr. Bradley has been a UK government advisor on international development issues since 2003 with experience across the global south. Based in New Delhi since 2013, he has coordinated the UK's policy and program collaboration with India on energy and climate change and leads a team whose partnership work with Indian stakeholders includes a range of subjects from climate change to clean energy transition, electric mobility, energy efficiency, and green finance. Over to Dr. Bradley.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to be joining you today for mainstreaming climate action in Indian cities, and delighted that in this session we will launch a new report, Seizing India's Urban Opportunity, which makes a really compelling argument that economic recovery and development investments should be made both low carbon and climate resilient in order to drive a path to green growth and development. I'm really happy that the UK government was able to support the development of this report. So congratulations to all the partners, to WRI-India, the Coalition for Urban Transitions, and other partners for working together on this call to action ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, which we're very proud to be hosting. So really, I wanted to say today that the rationale for this agenda is exceptionally strong. Much of the infrastructure that India will need over the next 20 years and beyond, particularly in cities, has yet to be built. And as governments put together economic recovery packages from COVID-19, the decisions that they make now will be really far-reaching, which presents a massive opportunity for us to take a new green path as we urbanize in a clean way. And Minister Puri spoke really powerfully yesterday in the session on the need for this kind of approach. And I think the benefits are really clear. Economic opportunity, green jobs, more livable cities, cleaner air, healthier communities. I think we can all agree that this is the kind of positive, low carbon, cleaner future that we want, rather than replicating the old polluting ways of the past. So the science is very clear that we need to act now and act very boldly. The impacts of the climate crisis are very real, very present. More and worse floods, more and worse droughts, more and worse extreme events. And India is one of the most vulnerable countries to these climate risks, which really undermine the development gains that have been made and have been so hard fought for in many of India's cities. So we're seeing these threats to urban infrastructure and threats to large numbers of highly exposed people. So simply put, climate change is threatening to put a brake on our future growth and prosperity, compounding the existing pressures from COVID, which have been felt really hard by India's cities and the urban poor. So I guess my message really is that every country, city, business, and part of society needs to follow that science and embrace this collective responsibility to keep the goal of 1.5 alive. That is, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, because by keeping 1.5 alive, we keep a sustainable growth and development story alive. So obviously, we're thinking a lot about COP26 in November. This will be a key moment where all countries come together to reaffirm their commitment to this agenda, ramp up global action in some of the key areas that are really going to affect cities, because cities are going to play a central role in this story. They contain the most people, they produce the most economic output, they create growth, jobs, opportunity, but equally they contribute most of the emissions and suffer most of the pollution. I mean, we're all suffer the fact that 22 of the world's 30 most air polluted cities are in India. And we're seeing a lot of action already in India to tackle some of these issues. We've seen the commitment to achieve 450 gigawatts of renewable energy. We've seen national programs on housing for all, rejuvenation and transformation, smart cities. And the UK is really a close partner with India on a range of initiatives. We're working together on the global coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure to make sure urban and infrastructure development is made more resilient. We're also working on climate resilient cities aligned with the Smart Cities mission, supporting cities to develop low carbon, climate smart plans to attract investment. Also working on the energy side with state partners and central government to assess feasibility and create pilots for city decarbonisation to enable switches to clean energy. And with Niti Aayog and states, we're working to accelerate the transition to electric mobility. So working on a range of things, pilot projects for affordable housing using green tech, looking at how we link up our trade and investment partnerships to help build those kind of commercial links that will help to drive solutions. And with the Coalition for Urban Transitions, the C40 initiative and cities finance, we're supporting climate leadership in cities by supporting selected megacities in countries like India to plan and implement ambitious climate action. So just a range of areas where the UK and India are working really closely together on this agenda. But what else can we do, particularly on the path to COP26? The final point I wanted to make today is really about this idea of action that cities can join. And there I would really highlight the UN's Race to Zero, the largest ever alliance committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I think there's a general consensus this is the best way to show commitment to this agenda, by joining the biggest and most important global campaign of leaders from businesses, cities, regions, and investors for a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery that prevents some of these future threats while creating decent jobs and unlocking inclusive, sustainable growth. So let's seize that urban opportunity and spearhead India's progress towards an exciting, low carbon, resilient future. It's not just the right thing to do for our urban environments, it's also a very smart economic choice. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I wish you a great discussion today that can inspire even more action. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. Bradley, for helping set up the discussion that we'll be having today, as well as the UK government's support on this report. To that end, I'd like to invite my colleague, Nick Godfrey, who's currently the co-founder and the director of the Coalition for Urban Transitions, which is an organization co-managed by WRI and C40 cities. I invite him to tell us a bit more about the coalition and the report series of which this India report is a part of, and to officially launch the India report. Nick.
Thanks, Aarti. A real tremendous pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen and run through a few slides with you all today. So I think it's my role to spend the next 5 minutes just painting a picture globally of what we see as the global urban opportunity, and then Aarti will say something about how does this play out in the Indian context, and what is the enormous opportunity that India and India's policymakers have to transform cities to support prosperity and climate safety. So I'm just going to say something about a major global report that we recently produced in partnership with a whole range of institutions. And over the last 18 months or so to support the UK COP presidency. And we're enormously thankful to the UK government, but all of our partners, including WRI-India, that have helped us shape this effort. So first thing to say is, who is the Coalition for Urban Transitions? Arti just mentioned we're a major global initiative supporting the efforts of national governments to transform cities in ways that accelerate development and encourage climate action. And this report that we're launching today, Seizing India's Urban Opportunity, is part of a broader effort to support the UK COP presidency in building momentum ahead of COP26, and is part of a broader global report series that has been a collaborative effort created in consultation with experts and policymakers across 6 focus countries, including India, and has involved input from across 36 organizations spanning all 5 continents, and follows on from the foundational 2019 Climate Emergency Urban Opportunity Report that we produced in partnership with the UN Secretary General. So what does this global effort cover? Well, as I mentioned, the global report effort contains analysis for 6 key countries that account for over 1/3 of global GDP, over 40% of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use, and account for over 40% of the world's urban population. So China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and of course, India. And Arti will say something more about the India report that forms part of the global series, but this chapter really explains how can India mobilize its national missions to unleash the full potential of climate smart cities. As I mentioned, this has been a partnership of many institutions. We're very lucky to be co-hosted by the World Resources Institute, the Ross Centre for Sustainable Cities, and C40, in partnership with a wide range of other institutions, all of whom you can see here. But what does the global picture look like? Well, in our view, national governments globally are facing 3 key challenges. The challenge of post-COVID recovery, and we know how devastating the crisis has been and has played out in India. National governments are facing the challenge of long-term development and enhancing well-being and prosperity for all of their citizens. And of course, are confronted with the enormous global challenge of climate change. In our view, cities are right at the heart of helping national governments address this triple challenge. Cities produce over 80% of the world's GDP. They're home to well over half of humankind. So cities must be right at the heart of helping national governments address this triple challenge. The good news is globally, we know the pathway. Great. The good news is that globally, we know the pathway to zero carbon cities. This just gives you a sense of globally, it is possible, based on currently available technology and practices, to get to close to net zero by mid-century with major investments across the built environment, transport, waste, material efficiency, and decarbonisation of the electricity supply. Yes, that will require new investment globally of the order of magnitude of 2% of global GDP, an additional 2% year on year for the next 3 decades. But our analysis shows that that will generate enormous returns. In fact, returns with a net present value of over $24 trillion by mid-century and support an enormous number of new jobs, 87 million in 2030, 45 million by mid-century. So not only can we get there, but it will generate significant economic and wider dividends. We've shown what the scale of the economic dividends look like with that type of investment profile across the 6 countries that I mentioned before, and Arti will say more about what that means in the case of India. But India can make an incremental investment out to mid-century in the order of $3.6 trillion, but that would generate significant returns, a net present value based on direct savings alone of close to $2 trillion. So in simple terms, the benefits exceed the costs by at least $2 trillion based only on direct cost savings alone, setting aside all of the other ancillary benefits. We also know the job dividends will be significant in India, 8.2 million in the next decade alone. And you can see how this plays out in the other 5 countries that I mentioned. my final message really is that, we looked at, well, who needs to do what to drive this type of urban transformation? And globally, national leadership is absolutely fundamental to complement local leadership by mayors and other municipal leaders. National governments or higher tiers of government have primary authority over the measures required to achieve 2/3 of global urban abatement potential, including decarbonisation of urban electricity. And we know in China and India, for example, that the share is significantly higher. So the role of national government is absolutely fundamental to complement that of other tiers. We've launched this year a global call to action where we call on national governments in partnership with urban leaders and financial institutions to go faster and further, working together to help transform cities globally. National government should develop an overarching strategy to deliver shared prosperity with cities right at its heart, pursuing national policies to support compact, connected, clean and resilient cities. And I want to congratulate the Indian government for the steps that they're taking. Urban leaders should work together with national governments to support this transformation. And clearly the IFIs and DFIs should work together to build a multilateral system fit for purpose, one that fosters inclusive, resilient and zero carbon cities. And Dan mentioned before some of the steps the UK government is taking in this regard. So thank you very much. I hope that sets the scene of what we see as the moment to really seize the urban opportunity. I'll hand over to Arthi to walk us through what this looks like in the context of India in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. And having worked on the India chapter myself, I'm happy to share additional details on some of the findings from the report. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen? All right, so as has already been said, we are urbanizing very quickly. In numbers, what that means is that in 2018, India was approximately 35% urban, with a population of 461 million. But by 2050, we're going to add another over another 400 million to hit 877 million, or almost 53% urban, and providing decent housing, public services and jobs for so many people in such a short time, and doing so equitably and sustainably is a daunting challenge. On the poverty front, India's already made significant progress. We've lifted over 270 million people out of multidimensional measures of poverty between 2005 and 2015 alone. But COVID hit really hard, and especially the informally employed, with the number of people living under $2 per day growing by an estimated 75 million last year alone. Creating jobs was a massive task even before COVID. A McKinsey report estimated that India would need to absorb 90 million workers that were either entering the labor force or moving from farm to non-farm sectors between 2018 and 2030. And that's not to mention the massive gender gap that currently exists in employment, which would require an additional 55 million jobs. And finally, providing this workforce with housing, mass transit, water and energy infrastructure is another massive challenge that lies ahead. So obviously, the Indian government has recognized the importance of cities in its vision for the future and has established a slew of national programs. These include Amrit, Swachh Bharat, PMAY, the Smart Cities Mission. And between 2015 and 2019, about 54,000 crore rupees was invested in these schemes, and another 66,000 crores has been budgeted since. Under PMAY, 10.9 million units of affordable housing have been approved, 4.1 million completed by the end of 2020, and another 3 million under construction. And the scheme has also created an estimated 23 million jobs. And finally, to complement these programs, the government has launched an ambitious India investment grid, which is led by the Ministry of Finance and Corporate Affairs. And this aims to mobilize $1.5 to $2 trillion in public and private investments to finance the national infrastructure pipeline. In addition to the schemes under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, other ministries have launched several other schemes and programs to support these efforts. We're investing heavily in improving public transport systems in India. These include metro rail projects and feeder services and infrastructure to integrate other modes of transport with the metro. As of end of 2020, there were more than 700 kilometers of metro rail lines operational in 18 cities across the country, with another 1,000 kilometers under construction. India is also prioritizing building energy efficiency through the Cooling Action Plan launched by the Ministry of Environment, which aims to reduce cooling energy and refrigerant demand by 30% over the next 20 years. The growing demand for shared mobility offers an opportunity for India to lead in innovating technology and business models in the electric mobility space. This is through the Ministry of Heavy Industries FAME scheme, which will promote the manufacture of electric and hybrid vehicle technology, incentivize demand, and improve charging infrastructure. And finally, energy efficiency offers a major opportunity for savings and GHG reductions. Amongst the Ministry of Power's many initiatives for energy efficiency, one of particular promise is the work of the Super ESCO Energy Efficiency Services Limited, EESL, which is a joint venture between 4 utilities. And since its establishment in 2009, it has helped India achieve 47 billion kilowatt hours in annual energy savings. So where next? For this report, analysis and modeling was carried out by the Stockholm Environment Institute using a bottom-up approach and developed using data from the International Energy Agency, Climate Watch, Global Buildings Performance Networks, and a few other data sources. And the modeling shows that over half of India's urban abatement potential to 2050 actually comes from cities with fewer than 1 million residents today, as against 25% in larger cities of over 5 million. And further, sectorally speaking, residential buildings hold 52% of the cumulative abatement potential identified, commercial buildings another 20%, and transport 15%. But across sectors, nearly half the total abatement potential depends on decarbonizing electricity. In 2019, India got 76% of its power supply from fossil fuels, mainly coal, but has pledged to increase the share of non-fossil fuel installed capacity to 40% by 2030. So as Nick had already said, building on the analysis from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, the Vivid Economics analysis calculated that incremental investments needed from now until 2050 to implement these selected decarbonization measures in India would be about 3.6 trillion. But as he said already, would pay for themselves through energy and material cost savings. In particular, transport offers a particularly attractive opportunity. $79 billion invested by 2050 could bring returns with a net present value of $1.4 trillion. It would also have the added benefit of reducing air pollution and traffic congestion. So finally, what are some of the avenues of opportunity in urban development to unlock this identified abatement potential? First off, we've identified that the government of India has an ambitious urban agenda, from the national missions to the infrastructure pipeline, and all this has the potential to build resilience, accelerate decarbonization, and improve living conditions for all. But making the most of these opportunities will require a systematic approach of actually aligning these national schemes and policies with the vision of climate smart cities. Next, as already mentioned, cleaning and greening energy is vital. Through the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, the Ministry of Power has already launched a number of initiatives targeting urban programs on lighting, commercial buildings, and appliances. In addition, the National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency has also set up 2 funds to enable project financing for and within cities. The market potential for these programs is estimated at about $10 billion. A key barrier to ambitious mitigation and adaptation action in many cities is limited institutional capacity. Cities need the funds, the technical know-how, and the capacities that, and the institutional support needed to operationalize national climate ambitions. Each level of government has resources and capacities that can be leveraged. The national government has vital resources. The state governments control land policy and acquisition, and local governments are probably best positioned to engage communities. And finally, though car ownership in Indian cities is rising, a large number of trips still involve public or non-motorized transport, and it is crucial to improve service for this large share of the population, prioritize them in road design, and improve safety for them. Now, one of the key themes of the Seizing the Urban Opportunity report series is actually how can insights from the 6 countries inform efforts by other national governments, development practitioners, and financial institutions. Essentially, how can we learn from the experiences and trajectories of other countries? To that end, I would like to introduce our next 2 speakers who will speak to their respective national experiences. Rohit, I'd like to, okay, thank you. So first we have Stephanie Chetty, the Acting Chief Director for Urban Development Planning at the National Department of Cooperative Governance in South Africa. Ms. Chetty manages and supports provincial and municipal implementation of the Integrated Urban Development Framework, and has previously worked at the National Department of Rural Development of Land Reform as a Chief Town and Regional Planner. The floor is yours, Ms. Chetty.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Thank you for this opportunity and good afternoon to everybody from South Africa. I am from the National Department of Cooperative Governance, and I'm so highly appreciated to be on the session today to share in some of the learnings and findings on what South Africa is doing in contribution towards seizing the urban opportunity. As mentioned earlier by Nick Godfrey, that we are one of the 6 countries that have been selected as well. So I'm just going to give you an overview in terms of our policy perspective and how do we then unpack some of the learnings and the findings. My presentation is detailed, so I will be skipping through lots of the slides, but the presentation will be made available for sharing. So I'm just going to give you an overview of our national policy called the Integrated Urban Development Framework, zoom into some of its focal aspects and alignment to what we're currently doing towards resilient cities. So just on conversation that everybody has already spoken about urbanization, the impacts that it has on climate change, and how do we then plan towards resilient cities and towns and integrate it to become more smarter as well in our approach. So we looked at how do we confront the spatial inequality that we see here in South Africa, who is fostering inclusion, what opportunities lie for citizens in South Africa, and who governs our cities and towns and who shapes them. So we've developed our national urban policy to address urbanization and spatial transformation called the Integrated Urban Development Framework. And its vision is to create livable, safe, integrated, economic, inclusive, and globally competitive cities and towns where active citizenship exists. So part of the vision is linked very nicely to the vision of the World Resource Institute in creating compact, connected, clean and resilient cities. And the IUDF aims to improve the way we do planning at a national government, right down to provincial and local, through 4 strategic goals, which is spatial integration, inclusion and access, growth and governance. And key to the priorities, the strategic priorities is urban resilience, urban safety, and urban rural linkages. So this is just the key programs that are focused on the IUDF at a metro level and at a provincial level and at a small town. The policy aim for the IUDF is aligned to our spatial planning aspects in line with the Smart Cities framework that we have also embarked on. These are some of the classifications that you see within South Africa for metropolitan cities, intermediate cities, and with small towns. So just understanding what is the IUDF in terms of addressing the vision to creating compact, connected cities and towns for both urban and rural. It is to ensure that we create a vision of cities and towns that reduces travel costs and distances, aligning to land use, transport planning and housing, preventing development of housing in marginal areas, increasing urban density and reducing sprawl, and shifting towards development that creates more densification and including linkages of public transport. So we recently embarked on the IUDF Implementation Plan 2025 with a focus on addressing more integrated approach towards planning, focusing on a presidential focus of the district development model, championship, partnering, seeding action, and peer learning reviews. So the IUDF just associates and shows the linkages between our national policies and plans. So we've just also shared a bit of the high-level political structures, our IGR structures that we thought that would be useful for WRI-India and their climate action and how they can also learn from some of these findings. Associated to urban resilience is very critical in terms of linking the IUDF 9 policy levers. So I've included a diagram there that shows the association between how important urban resilience is in planning linked with urban safety and urban-rural linkages. I'm going to skip a few slides because I know I have less time and I want to focus in on what's critical and important. In South Africa, we have both your urban and your rural aspects, and our metros are doing quite well in terms of development. But what we found is that there's a lack of integration between spatial planning that happens at a small town or a rural area associated with metro. So we've embarked as national government to develop a strategy that will address regeneration, restoration, and fulfilling economic potential for underperforming towns. And this also includes urban resilience into the aspect and climate action on how do we then develop these towns. So we have recently developed a strategy, and the strategy will be formally launched, and we will be piloting in 3 towns as illustrated in the diagram above. We've also associated ourselves with the UN Habitat to implement the UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements, and we will embark that in 10 municipalities in South Africa. And what we found then in terms of looking at urban resilience, we also took back a step in terms of developing a smart cities framework and how then to guide decision making and to share in local and international learnings and the realities on the ground, but not to not look at the preconditions of becoming smarter, but enablers such as a smart city plan, digital infrastructure, skilled people, partnerships, and community involvement, which also then involves climate action and resilience mitigations towards planning and achieving the compact, connected, and clean, resilient cities and towns. A few of our partnerships, and I want to zoom into the one with the World Resource Institute, is about understanding then with the National Department of Cooperative Governance, how do we link then spatial and economic development? How do we then also then share in ideas from rapid economic and employment recovery in terms of COVID-19 and get dialogues and conversations going? And then how do we plan together to focus on urban development and share in data analysis and urban resilience, building knowledge and coordination between our various cities and national authorities? So we have recently then embarked on work in South Africa. And as mentioned by Nick earlier, there's a chapter in South Africa on seizing urban opportunity, and it was launched on the 28th of July. And it's to tackle urban poverty and inequality that exists. And the report highlights 6 key ways for South African government to ensure robust, socially accelerated transformation. And this includes accelerated policy reforms, pro-poor urban measures in the heart of plans, and understanding then how LED forms an important role, and then prioritizing improved mobility to lower income residents and revamping housing strategies, and how do we then prioritize going forward, and providing targeted support for cities to make a difference on economic structures, and then protect and restore the ecosystems in and around cities in investing in greening and urban landscape. So those are that we have also then started another initiative with the Urban Water Resilience Initiative in 2 of our metros, being the city of Johannesburg and Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. So what we thought that's key coming out from the session today is how do we then share with the various institutions on the platform and organizations and countries here today, and how do we collaborate and move towards urban resilience and climate action? And what does it mean then to foster an all of society approach in developing these climate actions for cities and towns, and how important it is for enabling seeding action in the development and design as we move forward with our various strategies and plans associated with our urban resilience and seeding urban action. So in terms of championing, what does it mean? And I know that South Africa has embarked on many examples that we are welcoming and we can learn from and share in ideas. And then how do we access available funding for climate action given economic conditions brought about by COVID? And then another one is how do we build and sustain our various partnerships? So very useful, and I leave you with this. From South Africa's side, we really recommend peer learning reviews and support and collaboration on this. I think it'll be a really interesting process to learn from what other countries are doing, particularly in showcasing and sharing some of our examples from South Africa regards to climate action and the interventions that we have taken, and then also then learning both internationally and nationally from everybody here on the platform. Program Director, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Chetty. That was fascinating. I think South Africa's climate ambition feels very familiar, and some of the challenges as well. Finally, I'd like to introduce our next speaker to share his experience with China, and I'd like to also let our audience know that you can enter your questions on text, and after Daizong has spoken, we will open the floor for some questions. So next, I have my colleague from WRI China, Daizong Liu. Mr. Liu is the director of WRI China's Ross Center for Sustainable Cities and has led and managed a number of projects, including ones on mass transit, congestion, road safety, and sustainable and livable cities. Over to you, Mr. Liu.
Okay. See my screen? Sorry, I don't know what problems.
Sorry, we just had some technical difficulty. Over to Daizong.
Sorry, I don't know why they have some technical problem. Now, can you see my screen? Okay, great. So I'm very happy to talk about Chinese cities' experience from the early peaking to the carbon neutrality. First of all, I'm from WRI China, so we help China to promote the climate ambition. This slide just show you how how important of China's role in the global climate cooperation, because today we are the largest CO2 emission country and almost twice of the United States. So this is why China play a very important role in the global climate cooperation. And the last year, China committed to the international global, that's we want achieving carbon peaking before 2030 and the carbon neutrality before the 2060. And this year, they are more clearly to say that the carbon neutrality means the GHG emissions zero, not only the CO2 emission, that also includes the non-CO2 fossil fuel. And based on this two carbon peaking and the carbon neutrality goal, China have some detailed plan how to reduce the emission intensity, also increase the non-fossil fuel in energy sector, and increase the wind and solar powers, and also increase the carbon sink. So this is some details of the target by the China. And then we can find in Chinese, the cities play very critical things, because 80%, 85% of the energy-related carbon emission is from the city level. So the city, how we can achieving the carbon zero city is very important for the Chinese climate ambition. And here show you the urbanization situations in China. Today, China have a 63% of the urban, the population is urbanized. So that's 60 is almost 1 billion the citizen. And as our target by the 2035, we will reach to the 75% of the urbanization rate, and the 80% by the 2050 is almost close to the OECD countries, the average rate. And so this means today China not only focus on the urban planning, the new town plannings, but also need thinking about the regeneration, the existing situations. And during the last 10 years, China city already started to do a lot of things. For example, we have a national program named the Low Carbon Palette Cities and the Province Initiative. This is launched by the 2010. It's almost 11 years ago. And today we have 87 low carbon palette cities in the nationwide. It's almost take upon 1/3 of China's population. So they are committed. So this 87 cities were receiving the funding from the national, and also they have dedicated funding to build up the early peaking cities. And first of all, this pilot city need to restructure the governance to more easily to measurement the carbon emission. So this initiative is launched by the Ministry of NDRC, and then directly go to the municipal government. So municipal government will build a low carbon leading group, for example, the mayor office, and also where they will do very spatial the low carbon city planning, and then they will go to the special annual targets and the projects to propose by proposal to do the carbon early peaking projects. And then this project will have a post-evaluation. And this post-evaluation will go back to the municipal government and also go to the national level. And they also go to the public, and they have the rank, how the progress of each city. And today, you can find here, the green dot means that the city set the goal to early peaking during the 14th five-year plan of China. That means before the 2025. And the yellow dot cities means they were achieving the early peaking by the 2026 to 2027. The red one is a little bit slow. They were achieving before the 2030. So that is the 15th five-year plan of China. And what they are really doing after the goal of the early peaking, they will do some in the planning phases, the pilot city, their legislation, they will define the emission peaking target and the roadmap. And very interesting, they will also put the low carbon development as one KPI to the senior officers, like the mayors. And they will establish the low carbon mayor's office, like in Guangyuan and Chongqing. They really have the climate change response department. And also they need to coordinate with other pilots, and they will make some low carbon association, not only for the public sector, also invite the corporation, the private sector together to promote the early peaking. And during the construction phases, they will require carbon emission assessment for the larger infrastructure investment. So if you cannot pass this assessment, you cannot have this kind of infrastructure be constructed. And they will have a more dedicated fund for low carbon industry, include R&D and the construction. And also they can subsidy this kind of work. And they will conduct some pilot in the neighborhood community level to promote the low carbon community pilots. And also in some cities like Ningbo and Shenzhen, they promote the near zero carbon emission zone, quite similar as London. That's focused on the clean energy vehicle can go into inside this region. So this is during the construction phases, how they are doing. And in the end users phases, they will conduct the GHG inventory work to identify very high emission sector, and they want to establish the carbon emission data platform, and they want to build up the trading systems for in the city level. For example, in Beijing, the carbon emission trading pilots for some organization, and low carbon product labeling and the certification. So that means the customer buy the food from the supermarket, they can know how many CO2 emissions by this good and food. So that is all what we have done for the 10 years. But today, we need moving forward from the early peaking to the carbon neutrality. So WRI China, we are working with the ministry and the local city together to help them to promote. And we have such kind of plan. First of all, China still have 20% of urban in the new areas. So that's why we want to promote a very compact urban planning system. So the World Bank and the GEF, they launched the TOD pilot projects in China, in 7 Chinese cities. They want to concentrate the land use along the public transportation corridors. So this is what we want to do for the new towns planning. But most of the Chinese cities are in the existing situations. We need to think about the urban regeneration. So in these areas, we have 5 key areas in Chinese carbon neutrality cities, like buildings, transportation, industry, waste management, and the carbon sink. This is the 5 areas for the urban regeneration to promote the carbon neutrality. For example, today they are thinking about the climate adaptive buildings. They want to integrate the energy and the solar powers together with the building when you regenerate the building. And they want to use a circular economy to put the waste to the energy. And also they want to think about the energy storage, which can be better used to utilize the renewable energy. And also they do distribution, very micro energy systems, and like a microgrid or vehicle to energy, these kind of things to make the building more efficient for the energy use. And secondly, they want to prevent the common mistake what had happened before. For example, they want to make some mistake for the low density the urban sprawl. And in some area of China, the heating cost is calculated based on the square meters of apartment. But in the future, we want to calculate based on the CO2 emissions created by this the heating. And also like the glass curtain wall, they have a lot of, for example, that's a railway station in Shanghai using the glass curtain wall. So it's quite not energy efficiency. And we need thinking about the super high rise buildings. So China now today eliminates very super high, more than 500 meters high high rise building. And also the central eye condition is a problem today, how we think about to improve the quality. So this is some mistake. And in transportation sector, and we I still have 3 slides. So in transportation sectors, we can find the vehicle electrification can contribute 35% of the road transportation emissions mitigation, and the clean green can contribute 18%, and the VKT reduction can contribute 12%, and the modal shift can contribute the 35%. So this is measures together to promote the transportation sector, how to reduce the CO2 emission. And the waste management, they want to establish the multi-level recycling systems for high efficiency, efficient resource use, like to define the waste management and the price standard. So in the future, you will, if you they want to promote the zero waste the cities and reduce the proportions of the disposable products and some configurations and utilized. And the last one is a carbon sink. So they want to build a city combined with the park, also build a city in the park. And based on that one to promote the desertification control or develop the electricity, water, soil, forest, sink models together and promote the biomass carbon capture and storage. So that's all China thinking. WRI China work with the local city, how to help the city from the early peaking to the carbon neutrality. But we thinking India city need to fully understand the difference between China and India. For example, the India cities maybe in the different urban development phases. Some Chinese city already very post the industrialization phases. And we have a different urban planning system. China combined the top-down and the bottom-up together as planning systems. And we also have a different in the urban construction phases. China is focused on both the new cities and the urban regenerations. So, and the last one is different in the urban land properties right. So that's quite different because China, the land is owned by the government, by the state. So they can easily use a lot of way by the land control. So that's very quickly to brief what China want to do from early peaking to the carbon neutrality. And I want to more discussion later with our India friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liu and Ms. Chetty. I have to agree with Ms. Chetty. There is definitely scope for peer learning across our respective countries' experiences, whether in terms of how pilot projects help in building buy-in from local government, or even exploring the different kinds of governance structures and reforms that might help to operationalize some of these climate action plans. Before we move to the last section of our session today, I think we'd like to show one more quick video on the Cut Report series. So thank you again to Mr. Liu and Ms. Chetty. I don't think there were any questions that came through on the platform. So I think we'll move on to the last section of today's session, where we'll have a panel of experts from across India further explore some of the topics that came up in discussion so far today and to share their experience working to mainstream climate action in India. First, I'd like to introduce Mr. Hitesh Vaidya, the current director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs. He has over 20 years of experience in the field of urban management, urban governance, and capacity building, not to mention strong experience working with local government. Welcome, Mr. Vaidya. Our second panelist is Mr. Shwetal Shah. Mr. Shah is the technical advisor climate change for the government of Gujarat, India. He has worked on Gujarat's climate policy, adaptation and mitigation strategies, and climate finance, and in particular has been instrumental in drafting the state's renewable energy policies and the state action plan on climate change. Our final panelist is Mr. Raj Cherbal. Mr. Raj Cherbal is the CEO of Chennai Smart City Limited and has worked on various projects on traffic, sustainable transportation, and urban planning, and has written extensively to promote decentralization and good urban governance. Finally, though I'm sure he needs no introduction, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our panel today, WRI-India's own CEO, Mr. O.P. Agarwal. Previously a member of the Indian Administrative Service for many years, he was also the World Bank's Global Urban Transport Advisor and has written several papers on urban transport policy and governance issues. I'll hand it over to O.P. sir to kick off the panel.
Thanks very much, Aarti, and thanks to all the presenters. To me, it was absolutely fascinating. But the message I get from all this is 3 or 4 big messages that I'm taking away from this. 1, cities are growing. 2, most of the economic growth will happen in cities. And 3, most of the carbon emission growth will also happen in cities. So these are the 3 big messages I'm taking. And that's why if we have to work towards a net zero or work towards a 1.5 degree, our countries will have to focus a lot on their cities. Fortunately, in India, we have recently started the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs through the National Institute of Urban Affairs, which is Hitesh, who leads the NIUA, has started a climate smart cities program. for the first time that I have seen in that ministry where I've worked for quite some time, a focus on climate. I think that's a very positive sign that I'm seeing happening, a very positive sign. Hitesh is going to lead that work, of course, working with all the other cities across the country. But let me start asking Hitesh this question. Hitesh, this seems to be an ambitious task. And if I ask you, what you see are the one or two major barriers to implementing climate action in cities or taking climate action forward, what would be your response to that?
Thank you, sir, and thank you for inviting me. I take this opportunity to thank WRI and Connect KARO to invite me for this. Mindful of time, I'll be very quick. Just to everybody's knowledge, we, as Professor Agarwal talked about climate assessment framework, it was the first time we are applying this climate lens to the infrastructure projects, which under the smart cities it's happening. We have conducted 126 cities, which is like 0.5 million to more than 1 million, and 28 indicators broadly on energy and green building, urban planning and green cover, mobility and air quality, water management, and waste management. These were 5 thematic areas under which covered. And to the specific question, sir, the key asks from the cities during this whole thing was, you need to build our capacities. You need to give us tools where we can, what are those standards in these areas? You need to give us a templates to come up with the climate action plans. You need to give us technologies which we can apply within our system. Actually, you need to give us transfer the best practices from global, which we can contextualize, and training and capacity building, hand-holding, which will be last. So it requires a both individual and institutional capacity building, which is what the key asks were. So if I ask the 5 key asks which have come up from the results, and I will say that it was quite a positive results which we got it, but the key ask coming from the cities were in these 5 categories: give us tools, give us templates, give us training, give us technology information, and handhold us for a long time. So this is a key area, and if we took it, use the same language which we, and I think that you think the language of climate has to be the language of the cities who are executing those words. And if that is the one we do, I think we are in the right path to move forward.
Thanks, Hitesh. I think very interesting when you say language of the climate has to be the language of the cities. Very often we see the language used in climate is a mystery to people in the cities.
Yes.
And how do you demystify that language and get them to understand what this whole thing is about? If I read you right, you're saying that is one big thing that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Let me move to Raj. Raj, you're perhaps, I'm told, the only smart city CEO who's a professional. Most others have been taken from municipal corporations. You are the one unique out of 100 who's there. What is your view on this? From the smart city side, what do you see is the big challenge to climate action at the city level? Let's say, would you agree with Hitesh? Do you think there is a challenge there? What is it that can be done? Your thoughts.
Pointed out,
Okay, so can we, while he fixes, let me go to Mr. Shwetal Shah. Mr. Shwetal Shah, you are the technical advisor in the climate change department in the government of Gujarat. You must be facing the same problem in dealing with different departments of the state government in attending to climate action. They have a lot of priorities in terms of infrastructure to be developed. A lot of their focus is on building the right infrastructure, catching up with the infrastructure. When you go to them and talk to them about climate, what is it that you see? What do you think can be done to really enthuse them to understand climate and take action towards climate?
Shwetal, you're muted. Shwetal, you're muted.
Are you able to hear me now? This is Raj.
Yeah.
Yeah, Raj, go ahead. Did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. Yeah. So I think, since time is of essence, see, I think the problem is that with everything else, climate change is a very, sorry to say, that's a very theoretical problem still. If you ask most people in India, and especially engineers and so on, everybody's heard about climate change, yeah, but what am I supposed to do about it? And this is where I think the problem is. So for example, in a city or in a country where we are having difficulty with basic things, right? Should we do flyovers or should we do footpath? Should we buy buses or should we build an elevated corridor? That the debate in many places is even at that level. But on an optimistic note, I would say Chennai, and I'm sure some of the other cities have done some very strategic projects. Like for example, whether it's the pedestrian plaza, parking management system, bike sharing, these are all extremely painful projects to get done in any country. But in India, it makes it even more difficult because, first of all, why would you want to reduce the carriageway, for example? That's the first question that comes up. Why would you want to charge for parking when it's supposed to be free? Who cycles around in a hot country like ours? So I think sometimes it's kind of encouraging to watch the representative from China show their ideas. At the same time, it's kind of a little bit depressing also because our discussions are so much basic that we have a long way to go. But I think Chennai and a bunch of cities have done some strategic steps forward. These are very difficult strategic steps. But I think now is the time for us to start scaling these things. Whether it is pricing in parking, whether it is pricing in electricity, getting the pricing right, so that all these ideas are scalable and not just token pilots here and there. So I think many cities have shown the examples, and we have learned from Pune and Bangalore and others. And I'm hoping that others have learned from us. First of all, the good news is that people are taking it very seriously. I think the Tamil Nadu government has said the right things and started departments and policies to address climate change, which is a very, very welcome and very refreshing change. But now the question is, like Hitesh pointed out, how do we translate it into action? Does this mean more footpath? Does this mean buses? Does this mean more Miyawaki forests? How do you translate it into action is where the problem is, including, for example, people will say buy electric bus. But it's not simply a question of buying electric bus, right? It's the logistics, where would you put up these charging station? All these kinds of nitty-gritties have to be worked out. And these are not going to be easy in an Indian system unless there's a lot of capacity building and hand-holding to be done.
Thanks, Raj. Let me unfortunately, Mr. Shah is not able to join us. I think he's got pulled into some other meeting. So it'll really be between three of us that this conversation will happen. We'll probably not take more than another 10 or 15 minutes, but let me take advantage of this time to ask you, dig a little deeper. A lot of climate action, as we call it, is really action in many other forms. For example, cities are investing in public transport. They may not know that this is climate action, but they're investing in public transport for a variety of other reasons. It could be to ease congestion. It could be to improve air quality. There are multiple things that cities are doing. Electric buses are partly to improve air quality, partly to reduce dependence on imported fuels. How much do you think, at the city level, people understand that whatever they are doing right now is also contributing to climate? Do they see that linkage between whatever they're doing?
Actually, that's a very, very good question, because sometimes what happens, we used to joke here in Chennai that if some cities, for example, they may change one lamppost and then they'll declare it the greatest climate change initiative ever, right? Chennai, for example, a city of 10 million people, have completely gone from sodium to LED. And I don't have the numbers, but what I remember is the savings in carbon, money, electricity, etc. is so amazing that C40 representatives were saying, any other city, they would have made a big deal out of this and, got some United Nations award or something like that. We quietly went ahead and did the LED change, and it's just moved on to the next problem, right? So I wouldn't be too pessimistic, because we are doing a lot of things without calling it climate change or without calling it something specific. But but having said that, like any problem in India, the problem is scalability. Doing one thing here, one thing there is very easy. So, simple example I'll give you. I think somewhere in 99 or 2000, I remember going to Israel, and I looked down from my hotel. I saw solar panel heater on every roof, right? This was almost 21 years ago. I always ask this question: in a country drowning in solar power, right? How come I can't see a single, balcony or whatever with solar panel? And I suspect it has more to do, not to do with the idea of climate change. It is to do with financing. I can buy a 40 lakh rupee car without any money in my pocket because there's some financing mechanism behind it. But I just can't figure out how to put a solar panel on my roof without having to carry some 10 lakh rupees to a dealer or something. So I think the policy sounds beautiful, but translating that into market and action, we always focus on government footpath and government buses, but a lot of it is also private sector, right? So unless you, for example, price or make life very easy to buy a solar panel, or the other way around, make it very difficult to build bad buildings, non-green buildings, because of the way pricing is done, for example. So, for example, Smart City right now, we are building a platinum green building for ourselves and for the various offices. It's not easy to do it, right? It's not easy. It's far easier to simply build a box-like structure and put some conventional and AC and conventional and this and that, than to actually do green building. So my point is, it's not easy to do one this or one that, but how do you scale to a country of X crores people and 10 million people in the city and so on? That gap seems to be very serious. From policy to action seem to be a little bit of a leap, and we need to figure out how to do that. And last point I'll make in this one also is that even when something, for example, a solar panel, right? We Smart City, we did solar panel project, and once we did it, that savings is tremendous in terms of money, electricity, and so on. But getting that project off the ground was one of the most difficult things. I thought it'll be the easiest. You just go and buy solar and put it up there and it'll be done. The number of subsidies, I mean, the complications, the left hand has to go right, right has to go left. You have to fly to Delhi once in a while. You have to, run around the city figuring out who's supposed to do chicken, and a lot of chicken and eggs we have created in our system. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but the point is, not many people are going to have the patience to go through all this just because they're environmentally friendly or, they care about climate change. In order to scale, we have to make things so easy, like going and buying a car. I mean, ironically, buying a car is so much easier than doing many of those climate friendly things. So I think we need to seriously look at scalability and not assume everybody is going to be an environmentalist or everybody is going to care about climate change. But the markets have to function, prices have to function, and of course, government projects have to function.
Great, great. Lovely hearing you, Raj. Let me now shift to Hitesh again and then come back to you again, Raj. But Hitesh, you talked about capacity building. You talked about the need for tools, the need for templates. I think Raj has also articulated the same thing about the need for capacities. And you have this climate smart cities, the C-Cube framework. You have the Cities 2 program. You had the Cities 1 program. Do you think there would be value in looking at some kind of exchange visits with other countries? We saw some excellent presentations coming from China, South Africa. We will have fairly good work going on in Mexico, Brazil. Do you think there is space for this kind of an exchange visit to excite people at the city level into really recognizing what climate action can be, and how a lot of things that they're already doing is really climate action?
No, thank you, sir, again. And, while I'm answering your question and I'm going back to what Raj just said, and I definitely agree with him, a lot need to be done to make take policy to practice, and we need a lot of handholding, a lot of capacity. But I still don't want to be too harsh on ourselves. Out of 126 cities, if the CSAF framework we have talked about. Whether cities understand that it is leading to climate or not leading to climate, that's a story we can talk about it. But cities, as Raj very pointed out, has started taking those strategic actions. And out of 126 cities, 59 cities towards the CNG-based electric rickshaws, which is a major mode of transport. 88 cities have moved towards the renewable energy in the street lights. Around 88 cities are looking at monitoring their air quality. So there is a lot of strategic action happening in this 126 cities. If I take that as a 30% of the covering of urban population of India, they are already doing it. But what we need to do is really, when I say hand-holding, is hand-holding both ways. It's an individual capacity and institutional, but in individual capacity building, best way to learn, and that's my own experience, is when they see someone else actually have done it. If Coimbatore have done it, why not I can do it? If that is the within the legal framework, they can manage it, why not we manage it? So I think the exchange visits will do a lot of good things, because cities peer-to-peer learning will make much more progress than giving a lectures and webinars and all. But when they see it, when they feel it, and they understand the thing, I think our people are very, I will say they understand, they have a huge experience. All they need is that guidance, that exposure, that nitty-gritty where they can understand. And I think if once they imbibe those thoughts, it can definitely happen. And I'll give you a very small example. When we started way back in Sangli Municipal Corporation, and we took them to Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, even elected representatives. When they saw how the solid waste management was picked up, the first, and how the waste management was given even a dress code. First thing, they came back to the city and said, we want that type of a system in our place. We want every member of the corporation to be having a uniform, so that they feel dignity of labor, they feel corporatization like of atmosphere. So I think these exchange visits, both within India and abroad, will do a lot of work in building up this capacity building narrative within the country.
Thanks, Hitesh. Raj, coming back to you, I think what Hitesh is essentially saying is the problem that you pointed out, having a few pilots here is one thing, but scaling them up is another thing. And what Hitesh was suggesting is that maybe some of these exchange visits, people begin to see and believe and then start implementing. That could be one way of scaling up, is get them to see what has happened in the other place. I, for one, remember very clearly how when bus rapid transits were sort of in the early days, the first few that came up, a lot of cities began thinking about it after seeing Ahmedabad. So that sort of got them to believe that, yes, it can work. So what do you think about this? Do you think these exchange visits can be useful? Do you think using political representatives will be a good...
Nothing like seeing is believing. And especially in municipal administration, what I've seen is that when, for example, when we went to Pune, when we went to Bangalore and other places to study their pedestrian plazas and so on, it was a revelation to many of the engineers. Till the day they would say, this is not practical, just not doable. You can probably do this in New York City, but not here. The fact that an Indian city has done it and done it beautifully made a huge difference. Same thing with, like you said, we've gone to many trips to Ahmedabad to look at the bus rapid, because you always talk about Bogota, and the idea is that Bogota can do it, but we can't. So I think that attitude that it's okay in Germany, but not here is an issue. But also, very importantly, I think we need to compare apple to apple. Sometimes I do complain that if you show a Berlin or a New York City, first thing I notice is that there are hardly any human beings on the road, right? This is where a Hong Kong comes handy, a Seoul comes handy, a Shanghai comes handy. Depends on the context. I mean, when there are beautiful things in different parts of the world. So whatever it is, I think apple to apple, so that people get convinced, is one thing. I am also a big fan of templatization. I know it sounds kind of, I don't know, undemocratic, but I don't mean that you can cut and paste from another city to here. But the point is, if you take any problem, right, whether it's solar panels, whether it's a footpath, etc., the amount of thinking that has gone into any city, whether it's Bangalore, Tender Shore, or London or Paris or Shanghai, they've taken years and years and years, and some luck also. Maybe there were certain kinds of organization in that city that was able to accelerate that thinking. Now, expecting every Indian city to suddenly catch up with them in 5 days or 5 months is not practical. So you need, first of all, you need visits, absolutely, with experts on that city explaining how things were done. Second, immediate RFP, template RFPs, template thinking, template pros and cons. So, for example, we struggled endlessly with an escrow model versus so I don't know what is the other model called. You give money and you buy your own solar panel versus an escrow model where you do savings and that guy makes money, you make money type. But there are so many complications in these models that you can't expect an average engineer in a city to sit and debate this for month after month after month and expect some good result to happen. So I think all of the above. And the challenge we will face is that other cities had 100 years, 50 years, 20 years. We have very few years to catch up, which means WRIs of the world, municipal corporations of the world, everybody needs to now start accelerating, creating pilots, taking people around, creating those templates. And one more last thing I would say is that World Bank is coming to Chennai in a very big way, as part of a Chennai partnership because of the strategic projects we've done. They're supposed to invest a big amount. Tamil Nadu government is going to put a big amount in various sectors, from water, transport, and so on and so forth, right? But instead of doing a random investment, random project, there are certain fundamental studies that's getting done. So, for example, on road safety, on urban resilience, and C40 is going to help us with, let's say, climate action plan. So what we are insisting all these consultants and organizations is that ultimately those reports need to translate to concrete, steel, tree, plastic, wood, because this is the BOQ, bill of quantity is the only thing governments understand, right? What do we do? When do we tender? When can we make it happen on the ground? I think we need to have that sense of urgency to say, enough theory, let us move to concrete and steel. Do you want us to plant more trees? Fine. How do you plant the tree? Which species? Which is best for the climate change? Which is the native species? These are not easy things. See, experts may know these things, but 99.99% of the people won't know. And that's not the rest of the people's job to figure out which is the right tree to plant or what is the right kind of concrete to put. But my point is, so for example, concrete itself, which is a climate-friendly concrete. We are going to make footpath. Can we go leapfrog and do climate-friendly concrete? Can we do climate-friendly drains and so on and so forth, right? So I always joke that just when we figured out how to do footpaths and drains, now somebody's coming and telling us about climate change and resilience and complicating the matter. So it shouldn't be complicated.
I think we lost Raj just when he was getting really interesting.
No, I think I came back. So I say, no matter what you call it, no matter what the theory is, let us come down to trees, plastic, wood, concrete, straight line drain versus pipe drain versus box drain, whatever, right? Let's get fast so that theory can be translated into action. There has to be a sense of urgency.
Excellent. I think, Raj, fascinating to hear you. How do we, the one thing that I have always thought in my mind is in presentations that you see at various fora like this, what you get to see is what has been achieved.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't get to see is how did you achieve it? What are the problems you went through? How did you get around those problems? Those things nobody tells us. And as you said, you may have taken 100 years, but at the end of 100 years, this is the great thing that I have achieved. And now you expect that since I have achieved it, you can also achieve it. Absolutely. I think that how is missing in a lot of the discussions that I see on various fora like this, not just. So you pointed that out very well. And I think the other point that you made is very critical when you want to translate things to the ground is, what does your 1.5 degree mean in terms of cement, steel, brick, plastic, whatever it is? Unless you are able to translate it into that, the 1.5 degree means something remote. We don't know. Now, if we were to bridge that gap, what do you think would be a way of bridging that gap? Hitesh, can I go to you first on this?
Yeah.
No, sir, I think what Raj has really articulated. I think it's very well that when you talked about, if we are talking about India to be a 5 trillion economy, unless the cities start talking about how does I relate to that, what is my contribution to 5 trillion economy, unless we start that linkages back, that this is what a 5 trillion economy means, and this is how you contribute to 5 trillion economy. And that has to happen with, not only just a capacity building as a tick mark of training programs, but a capacity building as a mission itself, a separate mission to really look at it and, look at economic. Why do we look at cities? There's three things: improving economic viability of city, in making a quality of life better, and keeping it sustainable. All three has to be not looked at as silo, but integrated approach. And that capacity building mission has to really address all three, because all three are interrelated. They are not siloed on their own. Because if you want economic development, you have to have a good investment. And if you have a good investment, you have to have a good cities with a good environment, and you need to sustain that. And all three has to begin. And I think the focus has to be, I will call it in 3 words: build capacity, and build capacity. Not take a capacity, just a training program and kick it off, but deep diving in, and different levels of capacity, at the leadership level, at the practitioner level, and the electric representative. So they are also oriented, they bite. And that is where if we work out together in that scale, that is the only way we can reach that 5 trillion economy. Otherwise, it's a very wide gap between the vision and the actual ground realities in the place.
But Hitesh, tell me, I mean, what you say is very right. I mean, at least I can personally say that is very right. The gap in capacity, to my mind, is one of the biggest barriers.
Yeah.
But then building capacity in a mission mode, as you say, needs funds. It needs money. And my own experience has been that while people talk about capacity building, they're not really, that level of interest in resourcing it seems to be limited. You won't have questions for building a metro at 20,000 crores, but to spend 2 crores on capacity building, you'll have hundreds of questions.
Exactly.
Now, what is the kind of funds available to you for this kind of an activity? Are there resources available under any of the programs? I don't know if Raj or Hitesh, whoever is able to chip in on this.
I cannot give you quantity, but what I can say is that there is a huge amount of fund which was given, and administrative and other expenses, even in the missions, which I think Aarthi has just pointed out, 4,000 crores rupees in the mission for last 5 years, and the 10% was given, and out of 10%, even a 2% is allocated to a capacity building initiatives. I think we will be able to achieve the target, and it has to be very, as I told you, we have huge number of training issues. They all are doing on their own. So if we can create the capacity grid, very focused capacity grid, make it very performance outcome and outcome oriented capacity tools, I think we will be able to mobilize and create that financing gap which is there for, as you rightly said, nobody want to do it. But if we include this whole capacity grid and build up this all the training issues, make them responsible for 3 cities or 4 cities, and they should be able to build that outcome based money to them. I think they can. You need a small seed money, but an outcome was performance based capacity building initiatives then we can really create a mission on capacity building and design it like that way.
Any thoughts on the same question, Raj? Basically on resourcing capacity building.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really liked about the smart city mission was that they earlier, I mean, people look at foreign trip as some really bad thing. Here, every meeting, higher officials from Delhi used to say, how come you guys are not going to Europe? How come you're not going to various parts of Asia, etc.? So pre-COVID, I used to joke that if I had a choice, Smart City Chennai would be like a travel and tourism department. More than any concrete project, if we could take all the engineers and officials, send them around the world on study, some study tour, some leisure tour, because ultimately we need to experience leisure in a different country to realize, okay, there's another way to live, right? It's not simply about sacrificing and making it sound like we should all cycle around or we should take third-rate buses, because that's the image we have, right? If bus is for poor people, cycling is for poor people, Indians are aspirational. We all want to buy cars. So the question becomes, so how come everybody in Hong Kong is going in a beautiful subway? How come everybody in Paris is hanging around in the plaza? So I think we need to understand that we are not talking about eternal sacrifice. We're talking about a better life with added advantages, right? So I would suggest that traveling, I think a smart city mission and both the state government and central government need to actively say that here's money. If you don't travel, we won't give you the money. I mean, it has to be allocated, in my opinion, because that's what happened to various schemes. If you don't spend the money, you lose the money. So people are forced to spend the money, forced to come up with DPRs and so on. If you leave it as an option, then people, if you can spend 1 rupee on concrete, why would you want to go travel? So I think we need to take it far more seriously and say that X percentage has to be spent on well-meaning, well-done training program that also involves just interacting with people from other parts of the world, right? Including other parts of India. So I think the capacity building is going to be very important. One more last bit I will say is that if organizations, whether it is Smart City, whether it's WRI, whether any other organization, many years ago, I had proposed this to Chennai, right? We said, take Square part of Chennai, reimagine, because we were very frustrated that nothing was happening. We were trying to build a footpath, nothing was happening. Square piece of paper, and let's reimagine that part of Chennai, and what if it was Hong Kong? And a lot of that project, believe it or not, I am actually implementing it as part of Smart City and my team and corporation, because some the consultants were able to come back and say, look, if this was Hong Kong, this is what it would be. If this was Berlin, this is what we would do. So I would suggest that maybe, okay, take a few one big city, one medium city, and say, if you are serious about 1.5 or zero carbon, etc., can we now do a quick and dirty homework and they say, this is what electricity department will do, this is what a footpath guy will do, this is what the bus guy would have done. You don't have to argue whether it's real or not. The point is, imagine a group of experts, like I just saw presentations and all, to say, this is ideal Chennai to be done, right? You would have bought buses, this is how you would have done it. You don't have to get into too many detailing of it. But what would it take for Chennai to be 50% of Hong Kong or 50% of Paris or 50% of Seoul? These are the things to be done. I think that will trigger tremendous imagination to say, you know what, I didn't realize it was that easy. I mean, I didn't realize it was this easy to decarbonize. And also keep in mind the 80-20 rule. You don't have to go solve every carbon problem. We could always say that if you do these N number of projects, your carbon comes down by 80%. And thereby completely making even quality of life better, right? I think that kind of exercise will be required, in my opinion, for us to be able to leapfrog rather than doing inch by inch, trial and studying, U-turns after U-turn. We need to leapfrog. At least some cities in India have to leapfrog to, let's say, 50% of Hong Kong. I keep saying Hong Kong because it's very comparable to Chennai. I think it is time to take a few cities, at least on paper first, and then on reality, do that leapfrogging, then I think it just becomes a routine.
No, I think that's very well said, Raj. I think we've also run out of time. I don't know if Mr. Shwetal Shah is back. I see his picture, but I don't know if he can hear us, whether he's still there.
Okay, no, he's not able to join.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, just one last thought on this whole issue of exposure visits. You know, my own experience has been that converting an exposure visit, particularly abroad, from a shopping trip to a learning trip depends on how well you design it. If it is part of a longer, structured capacity building program, and as part of that, the person goes outside, and in that design, you provide space for shopping, he'll go for shopping only at that time. If you don't provide that shopping, he'll try to squeeze out some time to go whenever he wants. That's at least been my experience, that if you design it well, these exposure visits prove very useful. And I think Raj brought that out. So before we end, Madhav, I'll just give you a minute for any thought from your side.
And mainly, I mean, I think the conversation was fantastic. Clearly, capacity buildings is one of the pillars that we see. I think technology transfer also is the other key issue, and I think that's where also I think we could definitely support greater collaboration with some of our colleagues in China, Mexico, South Africa, to be able to exchange. So with that, really, want to thank everyone for their time, for their participation, and very happy to finally get the Coalition of Urban Transition report launched, and also I think would encourage all of you to look at the chapters on South Africa, on Mexico, on Brazil, on China, because I think these are valuable lessons for us here in India. And I think equally, I think we have a great story to tell. Given, we heard about the street lights, we heard about our renewable energy growth. I think these are incredible stories to tell other countries as well. So I think there are great opportunities to exchange, and I think this community needs to continue to build. So with that, I'll say thank you to all of you.
Madhav, and
Thank you,
Aarti,
Madhav.
back to you.
Sure.
Aarti, you are the boss now.
I think Shwetal has just joined.
Thank you, everyone. This has been great, and like Madhav said, a great learning experience.
I think Mr. Shah has just joined. Mr. Shah, I'm sorry we missed you. We're just winding up.
Yes, I would like to convey my best wishes to all of you, and especially for releasing this important report. Actually, I was called by Principal Secretary, and I had to rush to Sir's office. And as you all might be aware, Gujarat has some change in government. So we have to make a presentation of our activities to Honorable new CM. So I'm sorry for...
No, not at all. Fully
this.
understand.
Yes.
Fully understand given the changes taking place, and all the best to you. We really keen to see what you are able to do in Gujarat. Often you are a role model. Gujarat is a role model for other states. So we really look for you for leadership. But thank you very much for joining us. Right, Aarti, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panel, our moderator, all of our presenters today. And thank you to our audience for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Bye, everyone.